Hello, brother. Welcome to my channel. How are you today? I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like and subscribe to this channel, because we really need you to interact in the comments column. Enjoy and have a good rest. Case 1. I had been working as an IT specialist in a private data security company based in Jakarta. The month was July 2025. And business had been smooth until the night of July 12th. I was doing routine server maintenance when I received a strange alert, authorized access attempt to one of our clients' encrypted financial vaults. The IP pinged from within our own building. Assuming it was a glitch, I logged into the network to verify. The session was masked military-grade spoofing. But one detail stood out. The breach was happening from a physical terminal on the 9th floor. I was on the 4th. I took the stairs. Each step felt heavier as I climbed, my flashlight cutting through the flickering emergency lights. The elevator was down. By the time I reached the 9th floor, the entire office was eerily silent. Our company didn't operate this late. No staff was scheduled to be here. The door to server room B was ajar. I pushed it open slowly. The blue glow of monitors lit the room, and I saw someone sitting at one of the terminals, typing fast. The person wore a security uniform, but not one from our building. No badge, no ID, no logo. I recognized his posture. It was someone I had fired 2 years ago for tampering with client logs, and a former junior technician with high-level access that I had personally revoked. He had bypassed our layered security. Using a backdoor he must have embedded long before his termination. And now, he was decrypting files from a private banking institution, our biggest client. I didn't confront him. I backed away quietly and pulled out my phone. But just as I was about to call the authorities, a hand grabbed my shoulder from behind. Another man. I didn't recognize him. He wore gloves and had a police scanner clipped to his belt. They were too coordinated. They dragged me into the room and zip-tied my hands. My phone was smashed. For the next hour, I listened to them transferring crypto keys, scraping sensitive bank logs, and dumping cloned client identities onto a portable drive. I thought they were going to kill me. They debated at Target, actually, but in the end, they injected me with a mild sedative and left me unconscious in the maintenance closet on the 10th floor. When I came to, it was 3:40 a.m. The building was empty. I stumbled down to the security office and hit the emergency lockdown. The local police were called, but the thieves were long gone. The investigation took weeks. Authorities traced their escape route using nearby CCTV, a black SUV with government plates fake, of course exiting the compound at 12:47 a.m. The portable drive was never recovered, and the data breach was covered up to avoid media disaster. My company suspended all external operations for 2 months. I testified under oath. I was never charged, but I was terminated due to failure to prevent internal breach. I now freelance in cybersecurity, but I still see Andika's face in dreams. .com, determined. I know he's out there somewhere using what he stole that night to erase, reinvent, and manipulate digital identities for a price. And I carry the guilt that it was once my trust that gave him access to the system in the first place. Next story. In December 1975, student Susan Rencourt suddenly and inexplicably vanished without trace. Her disappearance was similar to that of 3 other young college-aged women who went missing under suspicious circumstances. Almost a year later, Skull was positively identified among others found on Taylor Mountain, one of serial killer Ted Bundy's grave sites. In Seattle, Washington, during 1975, young women of college age started to go missing with startling frequency, beginning in January, with the apparent kidnapping of Linda and Healy, and the disappearance of Donna Manson, who left her dormitory at Evergreen State College to attend a jazz concert in March, but never arrived. There were few witnesses who saw these women during the hours before they vanished. and there was never any reason to suspect that the two cases were connected to a single perpetrator. That all changed in April 1974, when several women came forward to report how they were approached by a man wearing his arm in a sling who asking for help. The first instance happened on April 12th, Good Friday, when a sorority girl was accosted outside the campus library at Central Washington State University in Ellensburg, Washington, by a man with his arm in a sling and a metal brace on his finger. She later told detectives that he appeared to be having trouble carrying his armload of books, dropping several of them. The young woman offered her assistance and escorted the man to his Volkswagen Beetle that was parked 300 yards away. When they arrived at the vehicle, the woman noticed something bizarre. The front passenger seat was missing. The two chatted for several minutes about how the young man had injured his arm skiing at Crystal Mountain. Although the man seemed friendly, the young woman couldn't shake the sense of unease she felt about him and the missing seat in his Volkswagen. The urge to get away suddenly overcame her, and she placed the books on the roof of the vehicle and ran as fast as she could. She didn't know it, but her intuition saved her life. Just 5 days later, another young woman would not be so lucky. Born on October 12, 1955, Susan Elaine Rancourt was also a student at Central Washington State University in Ellensburg, Washington, and she too had an encounter with a strange young man. On the evening of April 19, 1975, Susan Rancourt left dorm on the college campus to attend a meeting for living group advisors on the lower campus. The meeting at 9 p.m. was about a potential job, and afterwards Rancourt had made plans to watch a German film with a friend, but she never arrived. She was last seen around 10:30 p.m., walking across Central Washington State College lawns. By 3 a.m., her roommate Diana Pitt of Yakima called the dorm manager because she had not returned. "I got worried she wasn't back," said Pitt. After the report was turned over to the campus police, a massive search was undertaken. The search involved around 150 volunteers who walked across Ellensburg, checking the college, abandoned buildings and sewers that covered a 2-mile radius of the city, but nothing was found. A missing person case was investigated by police, who thought Rancourt might have stayed with friends, or had gone away for some unknown reason. A reward was put up by her parents of $1,000 for any information that led to her whereabouts. Susan Rancourt was described as 18 years old, white, 5'2", and 118 pounds, with blue eyes, blonde shoulder-length hair. On the night she went missing, she was wearing a bright yellow fingertip-length ski jacket without a hood, gray corduroy slacks, a yellow short-sleeved sweater, and brown hush-puppy shoes. A Strata freshman biology student, Susan Rancourt was considered very smart and sensible by her friends and family. Her father Dale Rancourt said although police had no leads, they were certain she had been abducted. Taking time away from his job with the Anchorage telephone utility, Rancourt helped with the search for his daughter. Police received leads that lead from Sitka, Alaska, to Boynton Beach, Florida, alongside one that pointed to Australia. "We believe Susan was abducted because she was always a very logical person, very predictable," her father said. "If it was one of my other children, I'd say just stand by. They'll be back in 2 or 3 days. But not Susan. She was always very careful." Dale Rancourt said Susan had put her laundry in the washing machine before heading to her campus meeting. The month after Susan Rancourt's disappearance, Kathleen Parks was reported missing from Oregon State University. In June, Brenda Ball was last seen after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien after talking with a man with his arm in a sling. Later that same month, George Ann Hawkins simply vanished from an alley behind her sorority house. These women were all pretty college-aged women who were similar in appearance, trusting, and it soon became apparent that these cases might be connected. The Pacific Northwest police agencies attempted to find a common link. However, it only became apparent when 2 women vanished on the same day. On July 14, 1974, Janice OTT and Denise Naslin were abducted hours apart at the Lake Sammamish State Park, where hundreds of people had gathered during the hot summer day. Witnesses came forward to tell police that the two women were seen approached by a young man with his arm in sling, and who introduced himself as Ted. That day, the stranger known as Ted approached several women at Lake Sammamish in an attempt to get them to leave with him to help load a sailboat onto his car. Several women refused, but OTT and Naslin went with the man with his arm in a sling. They were never seen again. Shortly after this, two witnesses came forward with information. On April 17th, the same night Susan Roncourt went missing, a young man was seen on crutches at Ellensburg by several witnesses. At about 7 p.m., this man approached a sorority girl, Jane Curtis, asking for help carry his books, and she readily agreed to help because of his handicap. When they approached his car, recounted for the police what happened next. She noticed the front passenger seat was missing and sensed something wasn't right. The young man asked Curtis if she could get inside his car, but she declined. When he pressed her a second time, she dropped the books and ran. She described the man to police as well-dressed and wearing glasses. The son of an Oregon district attorney who was visiting the campus also came forward and reported seeing a man with his arm in a sling, standing in front of the Bardo Hall around 8:30 p.m. on the same evening. Later, at about 10 p.m., another sorority girl, 21-year-old Catherine Claire DeLevo, was approached by a man asking for help taking books to his car. When they arrived at his parked car, a tan-colored Volkswagen Beetle, the young man suddenly dropped the keys on the floor. He then asked the girl to retrieve them. However, DeLevo said she could see the light shining on the keys on the ground and picked them up, placing them in his hand before she walked away. DeLevo said the man is wearing shabby clothing and a woolen hat, a description that was at odds with Jane Curtis' earlier description. Barbara Blair also came forward and stated to police that she saw a young woman in a bright yellow raincoat exiting Munson Hall. This description matched what Runcourt was wearing that evening. Another witness claimed he saw a man loitering in the parking lot and smoking with his right hand. He later saw a vehicle on his drive back to Seattle. These reports, although crucial to the investigation, did little to point detectives in the right direction. Shortly after the disappearance of Janice OTT and Denise Naslin, there were no further reports of missing women in Washington. It would be several months later, in October, that more women vanished in the state of Utah. In March 1975, two forestry students came across a disturbing find when they stumbled upon human remains while walking through a swampy, wooded area on Taylor Mountain at East. Police eventually unearthed 4 skulls and other bones fragments at the site, located east of Seattle and only 10 miles from a site where the skulls of OTT and Naslin were found in September 1974. The remains were eventually identified as belonging to Linda and Healy, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, and Susan Roncourt. On the day Roncourt's skull was identified, her father Dale was with his daughter's dentist in Anchorage when dental x-rays confirmed it was her. A mandible found at the site was also confirmed as belonging to Susan Roncourt. The King County medical examiner had taken x-rays that were then mailed special delivery to Roncourt's dentist in Alaska. There were several points of identification that made us almost sure the skull was Roncourt's, said Police Chief Al Pickles. This switches the case from a missing person to a homicide, he added. Now we have to make an attempt to determine in which jurisdiction the homicide occurred. Police were now convinced that a serial killer was responsible for the murders of young college students in Seattle, and the unknown man who called himself Ted was now the prime suspect in as many as 8 abductions and murders. Detectives started to search for anyone named Ted who lived or worked in the area, along with any owners of a Volkswagen Beetle. These were all common threads in some of the abductions, and witnesses came forward that each told a similar story of being approached by a man who feigned a handicap, gained their trust and help. With a list of possible suspects, investigators began to narrow the list down to find the killer. In August 1975, a suspect was arrested in the attempted kidnapping of Carol Duranch, who was abducted from the Fashion Place shopping mall in Murray, Utah. The man, Ted Bundy, was pulled over while driving his tan-colored Volkswagen Beetle, which was found to have what could best be described as a murder kit in the trunk that consisted of rope, handcuffs, a pantyhose mask, balaclava, and other assorted burglary items. After he was implicated in the kidnapping of Duranch, detectives in Colorado wanted to question Bundy over the kidnapping and murder of Karen Campbell, who went missing from Snowmass Village, Colorado, in January 1975. A forensic search of Bundy's vehicle found hair strands that matched 3 different victims, charged and sentenced to 1 to 15 years for the Duranch kidnapping. Bundy was soon charged with the Karen Campbell murder and was transferred to Aspen to prepare for his trial. It was during this time that Bundy orchestrated 2 daring escapes, the last of which saw him flee to Florida, where he perpetrated more murders, finally captured one again on February 15, 1978. Ted Bundy was charged with the Chi Omega murders and the murder of 15-year-old Kimberly Leach. Found guilty in both of these trials, Bundy was sentenced to death and transferred to the Rayford prison in Florida, where he would spend the next decade on death row. Although Bundy protested his innocence throughout his incarceration, he did offer detectives some information on the murders, but never once did he offer any type of acknowledgement that he was responsible for the murder of Susan Rancourt. It was only in the final hours before his execution in January 1989 that he confessed. Bundy admitted to the kidnapping and murder of Susan Rancourt that evening. April 17, 1974. He had approached several students in an attempt to carry out an abduction, but none of his intended victims fell for his deception. Bundy had used the same method on several victims, a method that was intended to disarm them. He would appear handicapped, having made and fitted a fake plaster cast with materials he had taken from his previous employment with a medical supply company, and used the cast on either his arm or leg in order to appear helpless. Bundy would then carry a large amount of books, and appeared to struggle to carry them. His intended victim would either offer to help, or he would request it himself. Once they accompanied him to his vehicle, Bundy would talk to them in an attempt to put them at ease. The victim would then place the books down on the seat of his Volkswagen, and as they knelt down, Bundy bludgeoned them in the head with a crowbar he had hidden under the wheel arch of his car. With the unconscious Susan Rancourt in his Volkswagen, Bundy drove her towards his burial site at Taylor Mountain, where his skull was later found. It is possible that her body was buried elsewhere, as Bundy confessed that he decapitated some of his victims in Washington and Utah, taking the heads home with him. It is likely he did this with Rancourt, and later buried her head with the others that were found there. The witness who saw a suspicious man smoking might have seen Bundy waiting to abduct a victim, and later saw his Volkswagen Bug with the unconscious Susan on his way to the Issaquah burial site, where her remains were found a year later. Like his other victims, Rancourt was likely strangled, raped post-mortem, and her body then used by Bundy for several weeks after death. Rancourt's skull was found intact, unlike other victims who had suffered fractures from his use of a crowbar to incapacitate. As she was only his 3rd victim, it is possible that Bundy had yet to perfect his method of rendering them unconscious, like all of Ted Bundy's victims. Susan Rancourt had a promising and bright future ahead of her that was cruelly snatched away by a senseless act of murder. At 18, Rancourt was at the younger end of his victims, who were usually aged in the 20s, for his crimes. Ted Bundy would pay the ultimate price in the electric chair Old Sparky. Case 2. On July 4, 1975, Nancy Baird vanished from where she worked, at a gas station in East Layton. Police soon found eyewitnesses who saw 2 men talking with Baird shortly before she disappeared. After investigating several persons of interest in the Baird case, detectives came to suspect she had fallen victim to serial killer Ted Bundy. By July 1975, Nancy Perry Baird was living in East Layton, Utah, and working as an attendant at a Fina brand gas station and convenience store near the southwest corner of U.S. Highway 89 in Cherry Lane. Baird was 23 years old and a single mother with a 4-year-old son who she was raising on her own with help from her parents. Born in Provo, Utah on January 14, 1952. Baird married young shortly after she left high school and had a child with her then husband, Floyd D. Baird. The union was not a happy one and lasted only a few brief years. Her husband moved to Wyoming, and Nancy relied on her parents to look after her young son. On July 4, 1975, Nancy left her son with her parents at their home in the small town of East Layton, Utah, and went to work. That day seemed like any other, and Baird served customers who stopped for gas and store items. Between 5:10 p.m. and 5:15 p.m., the town's only full-time officer, David Ray Anderson, stopped at the Fina station. In his report for that day, Anderson wrote that he interacted with Baird with nothing out of the ordinary. He then left the station and drove to another gas station on the opposite corner of the highway. Anderson wrote in his report that when he looked back in the direction of the Fina station around 5:30 p.m., he noticed a green van parked outside. He went over to check it out. But it is unknown if Officer Anderson made contact with the driver or what became of the incident. But by the time he arrived back at the Fina station, he found that Nancy Baird was no longer there. Her purse, containing medication and $167 from a cash check, and keys were still inside, and her car was still parked outside. When Bonnie Peck, manager of the gas station, appeared, she asked Officer Anderson if he had seen Baird, to which he said he had seen her 20 minutes previously. There were no signs that a struggle had taken place inside the convenience store, and together they conducted a search of the area, but found nothing. Anderson called in to his chief, who requested assistance from the Davis County Sheriff's Office in mounting a search for Nancy Baird. East Layton was a town of only about 1,000 residents, and at that time, its police department comprised of only 4 officers, which included a part-time chief, 1 full-time officer, and 2 part-time reserve officers. None of these individuals had attended Utah's police academy, leaving the department understaffed and underexperienced. East Layton police set about working out what happened to Nancy immediately after she vanished from a place of work. They put out a missing persons bullet with information about Baird. She was described as 23 years old, 5'2" in height, weighing 100 pounds, with long strawberry blonde hair, hazel eyes, and small scars on the inside of each wrist. She was known to wear a small gold pinky ring with rubies, and was wearing a smock with the Fina logo, blue shorts, and a blue halter top. Police then began finding out the identities of customers who had potentially interacted with Nancy by using credit card receipts from the Fina station. One of them was Denzel Williams, a resident of the neighboring town of Kaysville, Utah. Williams was interviewed by Davis County Sheriff's Detective Kenny Payne on July 5, 1975. The day after Nancy was last seen, Williams told Payne that he had taken his 2 children, 14-year-old David and 9-year-old Jana, to the Fina station at about 5:15 p.m. None of the Williams family saw a police officer at the station that day. This meant by the time they arrived there, Officer Anderson had already left for the next station. The Williams children entered the station, with their father remained outside, filling his car with gasoline. Payne then interviewed the Williams children, who reportedly told him they saw 2 men at the counter, talking with Nancy Baird. David Williams said many years later, "I didn't want to interrupt this conversation they were having. They weren't in a hurry to leave or anything." David handed his credit card over to Baird to pay for the gas, and while she completed the transaction, Jana Williams brought over a bottle of raspberry soda. As Jana only had 28 cents for the 29-cent soda, Nancy left her have the bottle for the amount she had. "I do remember that she was very kind," Jana Williams Gross said, as Officer Anderson had already left. The Williams children were the last people to see Nancy Baird alive. I didn't know how someone could take a pretty lady like that, Jana said. Detective Payne asked David and Jana Williams to describe the two men they saw speaking with Baird. They said both men appeared to be either 23 or 24 years old, and the first was skinny, with shoulder-length hair, a full beard and mustache, and wore a frayed denim jacket. The second man also had a full mustache and beard. His hair was dark but sun-bleached, and he wore a yellow long-sleeved shirt. A tool called identikit was used by Detective Payne to build composite images of the two men based on information provided by David and Jana Williams. These images were never shown to the children and were subsequently lost from the case files held by the Davis County Sheriff's Office. Almost 50 years later, the Cold podcast used an antique identikit to recreate the composites based on the information contained in Kenny Payne's report. The composites were shown to David and Jana Williams, who both agreed they resembled the men they had witnessed talking to Nancy Baird on the day she went missing. Denzel Williams also told Detective Payne that he noticed a third man outside the finest station, while his kids, David and Jana, were inside the convenience store interacting with Nancy Baird. He described this third man as about 55 to 60 years old, very thin, with prominent veins on his arms. Williams said he didn't see the older man go into the store, and didn't know if he had interacted with Nancy Baird in the days and weeks after Nancy went missing. Police began to narrow down a list of potential persons of interest they wished to talk with. One of these was Baird's ex-husband Floyd. Baird was quickly ruled out as a suspect after he provided an alibi, telling detectives he'd been camping with a friend in the area of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, on the date in question. Detectives then spoke with several of Nancy's current and ex-boyfriend, one of whom was named Dennis Forsgren, who said he had been out of state vacationing with his family at the time. This alibi was later verified by investigators, who next conducted a search of Baird's home. There, they seized her address book, as well as a hairbrush, with strands of her hair tangled in the bristles. They also came across one of her photo albums, the photos of which were compared to the two composite images of the men. The Williams children reported seeing inside the Fina station that day. A sheriff's lieutenant wrote, "There was a very similar likeness of one of the identikit composites to a picture from the photo album." The report said the photo was marked with the name Monty, a person who was soon identified as Monty Torres. Jana Williams was shown the photo by detectives, and she positively identified Monty Sick Torres as one of the hippie-type individuals that was in the service station. Davis County detectives learned Torres was in Pocatello, Idaho. They asked the Bannock County, Idaho Sheriff's Office to locate and interview Torres, who was described by a Bannock County detective as quite jittery. Said he had an alibi, claiming he'd been at Lava Hot Springs on the afternoon of Nancy Baird's disappearance. He then submitted to a polygraph examination. The outcome of this examination is unknown. However, newspaper clippings from the time seem to indicate the polygraph revealed no signs of deception on Torres' part. As a result, he was cleared as a person of interest. Davis County detectives then decided to speak with Nancy Baird's friends, one of whom had pertinent information for the case. An Ogden woman named Dolores Drake was interviewed in the early days of the investigation and provided information about an incident that occurred in the days before Baird's abduction. Drake reportedly told detectives that 2 nights prior to Nancy's disappearance, had gone bar hopping along Washington Boulevard in Ogden at approximately 2:30 a.m. on the morning of July 3, 1975. Nancy Baird dropped Drake off at her home on Ogden's 36th Street. Baird then departed alone, with Drake saying that she presumably headed for her home in Layton. Then Dolores said Baird returned a half hour later, at about 3 a.m. According to Drake, Baird appeared to be quite shaken and frightened, and that this fellow named Tom in a yellow van had followed her home and was molesting her. Drake said she had reportedly overheard Tom as he made threatening sexual comments towards Baird. Drake ordered the man to leave, at which point the man drove away in a yellow Volkswagen van. With the death of Dolores Drake, her accusations against Tom, whose full name is known to law enforcement, cannot be verified. It is unknown if this individual was ever questioned by detectives. By July 28, 1975, Ray Adams, the part-time chief of the East Layton Police, told the Deseret News, "We are at a dead end in the search for Nancy Baird." After 6 weeks, and with assistance from the FBI, the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Baird left detectives no closer to discovering what happened to the single mother of one. Baird's disappearance was one of several of young women who seemingly vanished in Utah between 1974 and 1975. Beginning on October 2, 1974, Nancy Wilcox went missing after she was last seen riding in a yellow Volkswagen near her home in Holiday, Utah. Just over 2 weeks later, Melissa Smith, daughter of the Midvale police chief, vanished after leaving a pizza parlor. Smith's body was later found in American Fork Canyon. She had been beaten, raped, and strangled. On November 8th, a man posing as a police officer attempted to abduct Carol DeRanch from the Fashion Place shopping mall in Murray, Utah. DeRanch managed to escape from the Volkswagen Beetle with a pair of handcuffs still fastened to one wrist. Later that same day, Deborah Kent disappeared after leaving a school play in Bountiful, Utah. Utah police became aware that other disappearances had taken place during 1975 in both Colorado and Idaho, but law enforcement were unsure if these incidents of missing women were connected. On June 28, 1975, Susan Curtis disappeared from a youth conference at Brigham Young University. "We had 5 missing women at one time," said former Sheriff William W. Lawrence. "Half we found part of the bodies, some of them." Lawrence had worked as the Davis County Sheriff, who was in charge of the Baird investigation, with little clue as to what happened to Nancy Baird. Detectives could only speculate if her fate was connected to the other missing women. But in August 1975, they got their first clue of a possible suspect. On the evening of August 16, 1975, a yellow Volkswagen Beetle was stopped by police officer Bob Hayward in West Valley. A search of the vehicle produced tools often used for burglaries. However, there were other more sinister items such as handcuffs, pantyhose, and a rope. The owner of the vehicle, Ted Bundy, was immediately arrested, and soon he was implicated in the DeRanch kidnapping, for which he was charged. "When a police officer does this for years, you develop a sixth sense," he said. "You feel it." Bundy was the worst of the worst criminals, and it took its toll on most of us. Lawrence's team of investigators set out to prove it was Bundy who killed Baird. "We had him in Rock Springs, Wyoming, which put him on Interstate 80 coming back from Colorado," Lawrence said. "From Rock Springs." Lawrence claimed Bundy headed west into Utah and chose to return to Salt Lake using Interstate 84. "We don't have any gas receipts that he stopped in the area," Lawrence said. It was Lawrence's theory that Bundy headed south. On Highway 89, the same highway along which the Fina gas station in Layton was located, "There's no women missing along I-80, Lawrence said. There was no abduction on 80 coming in. Sheriff Lawrence stated his belief that Bundy kidnapped and killed Baird and then buried her body in Lambs Canyon. Ted Bundy was tired. He had driven all day, Lawrence surmised. "I believe he went to somewhere that was close. It was handy, it was safe, it was secure." Bundy was familiar with the area, with the body of one of his victims, Melissa Smith, found in Parley's Canyon. As part of the Baird investigation, the Davis County Sheriff's Office provided a sample of Nancy Baird's hair, taken from her hairbrush, to the FBI for comparison. This was tested against the unidentified hairs collected from Bundy's car. FBI records indicate the federal agents did not find a match to Nancy Baird's hair in Ted Bundy's car. During his 1979 trial for the Chi Omega murders, Bundy spoke with a reporter in a recorded telephone call, reiterating that he was innocent of all the crimes for which he had been accused and convicted. Police officers, they want to solve crimes, and sometimes I don't think they really try to think things through, Bundy said during the call. They're willing to take the convenient alternative, and the convenient alternative is me. At trial, Bundy was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death for the first time. At a later trial, he was found guilty of the murder of Kimberly Leach and received his second death sentence, for which he was placed on death row. While incarcerated on Florida's death row, Ted Bundy spoke with numerous law enforcement officials and journalists about his alleged crimes. He always protested his innocence. Bundy spoke about his crimes in the third person during his interviews with Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth, but never admitted to any involvement. By January 1989, Ted Bundy had run out of time, and with his scheduled execution nearing, he decided to confess to crimes he had previously denied. He granted interviews with police investigators from several states who wanted to talk to Bundy about unsolved murders of missing women in their jurisdictions. Over the course of these interviews, Bundy claimed responsibility for a number of unsolved murders, describing to police the circumstances of the kidnappings and killings he carried out in Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. On January 22, 1989, Salt Lake County Sheriff's Detective Dennis Couch interviewed Bundy for about 90 minutes. During the course of the interview, Bundy admitted to committing 5 murders, along with 3 unidentified in Utah. Bundy had long been suspected of involvement in the deaths or disappearances of Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, Laura Am, and Deborah Kent in Utah, and many in law enforcement speculated that Bundy could have been responsible for kidnapping and murdering Nancy Baird. The Bundy interview with Detective Couch was audio recorded, and Bundy can be heard denying having any knowledge of Nancy Baird. Do you recall what type of place it was Baird was working at, or where it was located? Couch asked Bundy. No, I didn't have anything to do with that, Bundy replied. Later in the interview, Couch showed Bundy a picture of Nancy Baird. Nancy Baird? Who's that? Bundy asked Couch, seeming not to recognize Baird in the photograph. Bundy then goes on to say, I'm not sure who you are talking about. No, I didn't have anything to do with that. With his denial of this crime and others, Bundy dashed hopes of detectives in identifying 3 of his alleged Utah victims, who remained identified. Former Sheriff William Lawrence didn't believe Bundy's denial. He admitted that he had some of the heads of his victims in Utah at his apartment, Lawrence said. He mentioned Lambs Canyon. Lawrence is not alone in his refusal to believe Bundy's culpability in Baird's murder. Nancy Baird's in-laws also believed Bundy was responsible for her murder. Wally Baird said he believed Bundy's denial may have been a cover-up. He may have been that way because he didn't know at the time that she had kids, a child, and had been married, said Baird. That was something that was contrary to his M.O., method of operation. Lawrence said that Bundy's connection to Nancy had always been circumstantial. It was never enough for prosecutors to file charges against serial killer Ted Bundy and believe that Nancy's fell through the cracks in my judgment, and I felt guilty about it. Her case was eventually pushed aside when other major homicide cases happened during that time period. However, Bundy did seem to have an alibi for the Nancy Baird disappearance, as the likely prime suspect in the disappearance of Nancy Baird. Ted Bundy has been considered responsible primarily due to the time frame she went missing and the fact that he was active in Utah during 1974 and 1975. However, Bundy never admitted to kidnapping Baird, despite his 11th-hour confession to such crimes as the disappearance of Susan Curtis, who went missing in June 1975. During some of Bundy's crimes, his distinctive tan-colored 1968 Volkswagen Beetle had been seen. However, on the day of Nancy Baird's disappearance, there was no mention of a vehicle matching that description by witnesses at the Fina gas station. Furthermore, the suspects seen talking to Nancy at the store, described as hippie types, did not resemble Ted Bundy. After Bundy's attempted kidnapping of Carol Durange, The case file records revealed that he had briefly dated a Salt Lake City woman named Leslie Knudsen during the summer of 1975. Following Bundy's arrest, Knudsen provided a statement to police about her relationship with Bundy, giving details and dates. One of those dates was July 4, 1975, when Knudsen said Bundy had visited her family at a reunion that occurred at her family's ranch. Knudsen's maternal grandfather was a prominent sheep rancher who owned a ranch in Fruitland near Strawberry Reservoir, which is located more than 100 miles from the finest station in East Layton. From Knudsen's statement, Bundy seems to have a solid alibi for the date of Nancy Baird's abduction, in that he was over 100 miles away at the time. It would have been difficult, albeit not impossible, for Bundy to make the journey that day. Bundy was known to undertake long journeys in search of victims. One former law enforcement officer believes that Bundy had no part in the Baird case, and offers his own suspect. Thomas Jackson, a former East Layton Police Reserve officer, was in July 1975 the most junior member of the East Layton Police Force. Jackson had little participation in the Baird investigation, but did not agree with the Bundy speculation. Jackson believed that a fellow officer, Dave Anderson, might have been the culprit. Anderson had been the law enforcement officer who was present at the Fina gas station on the day Nancy Baird went missing, and was one of the last people to see her before she vanished after the two reportedly spoke. At the time of Baird's disappearance, Officer Anderson had only been an officer at East Layton for 10 months, and the majority of his time with the department had been spent patrolling U.S. Highway 89. Former Reserve Officer Thomas Jackson stated that Officer Dave Anderson had spent a great deal of time at the Fina gas station and convenience store. Anderson spent too much time looking at women too, Jackson said. Shortly after she went missing, Anderson left his job with the East Layton Police Department, and case records do not indicate he was ever challenged concerning his account of the circumstances of Nancy Baird's disappearance. Thomas Jackson replaced Dave Anderson as East Layton's only full-time officer, but decided to defer handling the Nancy Baird investigation, telling the Davis County Sheriff's Office he preferred they manage the case. "I wanted to let someone else handle it," Jackson said. "I didn't want to mess it up." By January 1981, the town of East Layton disincorporated and was annexed into Layton City. 5 years later, Officer Jackson also quit the department to take a job in the private security sector. As a result, the Nancy Baird investigation became a cold case with little or any developments beyond the Ted Bundy theory. Over the years, Baird has been ruled out as the identity of several bodies of young women, including Salt Lake City Jane Doe and Washoe County Jane Doe. The Davis County Sheriff's Office have assigned an investigator to review the cold case, in cooperation with the Layton City Police Department. The current focus of this new cold case investigation is on persons of interest other than Ted Bundy. That Bird's body has never been found still haunts the former Sheriff William Lawrence. He continues to firmly believe that Ted Bundy was responsible for the disappearance of Nancy Baird. "It's what we call the law of probability," Lawrence said. "It's not provable, but if you work back by process of elimination, you come up with the most logical scenario." Case 3. In late December 2012, Ian Watkins from Lost Prophets, the lead singer and frontman of the Welsh rock band, was arrested by police in relation to allegations of child sex abuse. The singer's home was searched, and officers found a number of indecent images. The resulting court case would go on to reveal the full, horrifying extent of Ian Watkins' depraved crimes against young children, something he managed to conceal for many years. Born in Merthyr Tydfil on July 30, 1977, Ian David Carslake Watkins moved with his family to Pontypridd, where he attended Hawthorne High School. There, he met one of his future Lost Prophet bandmates, Mike Lewis. Watkins went to the University of Wales, Newport, where he graduated with a first-class honors degree in graphic design. Watkins grew up listening to mostly metal and rock music. Along with Lewis, who shared a passion for bands, such as Faith No More. Together they formed Aftermath in 1991. However, the band never recorded any material. Watkins then met another future bandmate Lee Gaze, and they decided to form a new band. However, this too was short-lived. By 1997, Watkins, Lewis, and Gaze formed a new band, Lost Prophets, which made its debut in May 1997, with Watkins as the lead vocalist. The band launched their debut album, The Fake Sound of Progress. In 2000, they would go on to release 5 studio albums between the years 2000 to 2012, earning them millions, along with legions of fans. When on tour with his band, Ian Watkins requested his own private dressing room, separate from the other 5 band members. It was unknown at the time why he wanted this private space, and only after his crimes came to light would it become apparent. As a result, his bandmates went on to claim they knew nothing of what went on, citing his heavy drug use as a contributing factor in their strained relations. Indeed, Watkins used his private dressing room as a place to take female fans, something that many other musical stars have done in the past with adoring fans they wished to entertain. However, what went on inside Watkins' dressing room was anything but entertaining. One incident would be shared with the court at his later trial. In March 2007, he met a 16-year-old Lost Prophets fans at one of the band's concerts. The prosecution went on to describe for police what happened. They said the singer was excited at the prospect of taking the young girl's virginity and had her dress up in a schoolgirl's uniform and videoed them having oral, vaginal, and anal sex. He asked her whether she enjoyed being his underage slut, and at the end urinated over her face and told her to drink it. This encounter was an insight into how the singer treated young women and was indicative of his attitude towards those he saw as mere playthings. This incident occurred fully 5 years before Watkins committed his most serious crimes. Watkins met another fan in August 2008 and videoed this girl, also 16, having oral sex with him. On the video she is seen snorting white powder, which the singer told her was cocaine. It was this taking of hard drugs, intrinsically linked to his sexual activities, that caused him to step further away from his bandmates. In 2006, a 30-year-old fan contacted Watkins on the Lost Prophets MySpace account in order to arrange tickets for a gig. Watkins and the fan, Joanne Jegelix, started a relationship, one that she later described as quickly turning sordid. She told police that Watkins had talked about getting her pregnant so that he could rape their baby. The couple also talked about shit abuse while having sex. In an online chat, revealed to the court at her later trial, Jegelix and Watkins discussed topics such as incest, while acting out a fantasy the singer had of them being brother and sister. They also talked about cross-dressing child abuse, and the kidnapping of a brother and sister from outside a school, with the intention of killing one and raping the other. Jegelix from Doncaster in South Yorkshire said that in September 2007, during the recording of the band's 4th studio album, The Betrayed, Watkins described to her how he raped a 12-year-old girl in Los Angeles. At Christmas that year, Watkins sent her an indecent photograph of a 5-year-old girl posing with cocaine, who the singer described as super flirty. Watkins reportedly told her, "You know what little girls are like." She recalled how the image sickened her, saying, "My heart sank because it made me ill." As a result of that image, Jegelix decided to end her relationship with Watkins. "I was completely confused. I was totally in love with the man, yet he sent me this picture," she said. "How could I be in love with a man that sends that image? And he lied," she recalled, saying he only got her to pose with the picture as a joke. Around this same time, Watkins told her that he had also been abusing a 2-year-old child in California whilst the band was recording in Los Angeles. Jegelix claimed she then went and reported the incidents to South Wales police. However, no further action was taken. She wouldn't see Watkins again until several times in 2010, where on one occasion he tried to get her to snort heroin before showing her something on his laptop. She described the video. The first thing I saw was a child crying and screaming, and I saw a video of a young girl being raped. And I looked at him, and I just saw an evil smirk on his face. He was looking for a reaction, and all I did was cry, and I said he had to go. Joanne Yegelek said she had never met anyone as sick and depraved as that man, and that it was then she decided to play Watkins at his own game. She went to police again, this time to tell them about another woman who was allowing her baby to be abused by Ian Watkins from Lost Prophets. She told police the woman was totally obsessed with Watkins and her baby will be raped by him. Jagelex claimed an officer dismissed her claim, telling her she must have been really upset by her ex-boyfriend. She reportedly told the officer, "I'll put a bullet in his head to stop his doing it." As a result, she said police force records labeled her a nutjob. Lawyers for Watkins issued Jagelex with harassment orders, calling the testimony she gave police as bullshit. She took the woman whose baby was being raped by Watkins to the police, but she claimed they ignored her warnings. She said of Watkins, he was getting off on the fact he was getting away with it, and Jagelex said, as a result of her failed efforts to get Watkins arrested, Joanne and Jagelex began suffering with her mental health, which caused her to take overdoses in an effort to commit suicide. Eventually she decided to distance herself from Watkins, and even went so far as to put an obituary for herself in the newspaper in an effort to fake her own death. In late 2011, Watkins met a 19-year-old woman, who would be referred to in court documents as Woman BV2 began communicating regularly, and by March and April 2012, the discussions between them became sinister. By this time, Woman B had a young child, a 10-month-old son, and with Watkins, she had conversations about committing sexual acts with the infant. Woman B later told the police she met up with Watkins at the Copthorne Hotel in Cardiff, and on March 21st, he asked her to come down this weekend, and we can fuck him up again. In response, Woman B replied, offering up her child to Watkins' perversions. After previously suggesting getting her son high on ice or meth, the two met up again at the K West Hotel in London on the night of April 2nd to 3rd, and there recorded a video. During the recorded, Watkins raped the child, who had been offered up by his mother for the singer to abuse. On the recording she can be heard encouraging Watkins in his actions, taking an active part in her own child's pain and suffering, and both can be heard on the video to be gaining enjoyment from the act. On May 24th, Woman B messaged Watkins and told him, the boy is ready to be abused. A further message from Watkins, sent on August 2nd, read, "To be honest though, I think we have gone easy on him so far. Time to teach him and make him learn too. Love it." From these messages, police believe the two met up at the Maldron Hotel in Cardiff, where further abuse occurred. An image sent by Woman B to Watkins on September 9th showed a grotesque sex act she committed against her own child. By August 2012, Watkins started communicating with a second woman and mother to a young child. This 25-year-old, who is known as Woman P in court documents, told police that not long after they began talking, their conversations turned to child sex abuse. The couple talked of moving in together, and Watkins told Woman P, "If you belong to me, so does you, our baby." In response, she told him, "Understandable, a mother-daughter slave duo, worshipping you." Watkins replied, "That's all she will know, a life of filth." They spoke of sexually abusing the young child, and during subsequent communications, they planned even more depraved acts, including forcing bestiality with the child, and even the taking of drugs. Watkins considered the small child as a mere plaything, not as a human being, but a sexual object there for his own pleasure. He said he wanted to get both mother and daughter taking crack cocaine, and talked of whoring her out to fat old men who would pay thousands. He even spoke of torturing the small child for fun. Woman P took intimate photographs of her daughter and sent them to Watkins, and in turn, he commented on his intentions with her. On September 12, 2012, Watkins and Woman P had a lengthy Skype session, which would prove to be some of the most disturbing and graphic evidence presented at their later trials. On October 2nd, woman P took her young daughter to meet up with Watkins at the Travel Lodge in Carfilly, and also to the Radisson in Cardiff on the October 23rd. It was unknown what happened at these meets, and woman P allegedly lied, claiming she left her child with someone else. However, it is believed she took her baby and together they committed abuse, rape, and sexual assault. The police investigation into the crimes of Ian Watkins had been codenamed Operation Globe, which had been set up after the failures to investigate Watkins and his crimes had been scrutinized by the Independent Police Complaints Commission, IPC, with multiple opportunities to look into Watkins' crimes. From the many complaints concerning his crimes of child sexual abuse, a team of 25 officers were assigned to work the case, beginning in October 2012, and led by Detective Chief Inspector Peter Doyle. The Operation Globe team worked to uncover the horrific sexual crimes against young children and included officers from Germany and the USA. The operation also required the cooperation of GCHQ to decrypt a hidden drive on Watkins once investigators bypassed the encrypted password to his laptop. They learned it read, "I fuck kids," and his device was found to contain video evidence of his abuses. Among the trove were images he had made himself, DCI Doyle said, after the investigation had concluded. This investigation was highly complex and involved a large team working closely with partners, including local authorities, NSBCC, and Interpol. The team showed moral and professional courage in the face of harrowing and deeply upsetting evidence, which was by far the worst I have come across in my 30-year career. Throughout the investigation, the central core of the investigation focused upon the protection of children, and the team never wavered from that goal. Several years after the case had concluded, the Operation Globe investigation team was named runner-up in the Police Federation National Detective Forum, PFNDF, Detective Investigation of the Year Award. DCI Doyle said, "They thoroughly deserve the recognition they have received from the Police Federation, and I am pleased their hard work, professionalism, and dedication has been acknowledged." As a result of the investigation, a number of serving officers were under examination by the IPCC in relation to possible delays in bringing Watkins to justice. The roles of as many as 8 officers were being looked into, which was part of an IPCC probe that began before Operation Globe was set up. The officers included 2 South Wales police officers, 1, a detective constable, along with the roles of a sergeant, and 3 constables from South Yorkshire Police, and a sergeant and constable from Bedfordshire Police that were being looked at. It was revealed South Wales Police received information from 4 different police forces across Britain about Watkins' crimes. Watkins was first apprehended in June 2012, several months before he met woman P in connection to various drug charges, and he was granted bail shortly afterwards. He was arrested again on November 4, 2012, for drug possession and a separate allegation that he possessed an obscene image of a child. South Wales Police were finally acting on information provided by witnesses. From 2008 to 2011, a total of 6 people, including Joanne Zelix, had spoken to the police in regards to Watkins' conduct. Arrested for a 3rd time on December 17, 2012, on another drug possession charge, South Wales Police immediately conducted a search of his home. They focused on his computer in connection to their prior investigation and allegations made against him. During the search, officers discovered numerous indecent images of children stored on his computer. Of the images found, there were 90 indecent photos of children, including 45 at level 4 and 2 at level 5. Many other images and videos were of extreme pornography, along with 22 images of bestiality, including oral and vaginal sex with dogs. The ages of the child in the images ranged from 2 to 14 years old. Appearing before Cardiff Magistrates Court on December 19, 2012. Watkins was charged with conspiracy to engage in sexual activity with a 1-year-old girl, and possession and/or distribution of indecent images of children and extreme animal pornography. Owing to the seriousness of the charges, he was remanded in custody. His 2 female co-opt, Woman B and Woman P, had also been arrested and charged. Watkins denied the accusations, claiming he had no involvement in the alleged crimes. Imprisoned at HM Prison Park in Bridgend, he appeared before VideoLink at Cardiff Crown Court on December 31st and was remanded in custody until March 11, 2013. The trial date was set for July 15th, and at a hearing on June 3rd, Watkins denied all the charges. When appearing before VideoLink 3 days later, it was announced that the trial of Watkins and his 2 female co-accused would start on November 25th and was expected to last a month. Watkins' lawyers attempted to have the venue moved outside Wales, but this request was denied. On November 26th, on the second day of the trial, when the jury had been sworn in, Watkins and Woman P admitted to the charges, with Watkins pleading guilty to attempted rape and sexual assault of a child under 13, but not guilty to rape. This plea was accepted by the prosecution, halting the trial. He further pleaded guilty to 3 counts of sexual assault involving children. This included 6 counts of taking, making, or possessing indecent images of children, and 1 count of possessing an extreme pornographic image involving a sex act on an animal. The day after his guilty plea, a telephone conversation at HM Prison Park was recorded between Watkins and a female fan, in which he referred to his sex offenses as megalos. At a sentencing hearing on December 18th, Mr. Justice Royce said that court had heard a large number of horrific cases over the years, but that this case, however, breaks new ground, adding, "What you 3 did plumbed new depths of depravity." To Watkins he said, "You achieved fame and success as the lead singer of the Lost Prophets. You had many fawning fans. That gave you power. You knew you could use that power to induce young female fans to help satisfy your apparently insatiable lust, and to take part in the sexual abuse of their young children. Away from the highlights of your public performances lay a dark and sinister side." Because she entered her guilty plea at the first reasonable opportunity, Woman B was entitled to a standard 1/3 discount on her sentence. Because Watkins and P waited until just before the jury was sworn in on the second day of the trial, they received no credit, but were given the conventional 10% off their sentences. Watkins was considered the most dangerous by the judge, and in his closing remarks, he said of Ian Watkins and his crimes, "Mr. Watkins presents a high risk of causing serious sexual, physical, emotional, and psychological harm to children, both male and female, and to women, specifically his female sexual partners. I have no hesitation in concluding that there is a significant risk to the public, in particular to young females and children, of serious harm occasioned by the commission by you of further specified offenses. That risk is high." Woman B was found to have an infatuation with Watkins, while Woman P was assessed by a psychologist who concluded that she had a mixed personality disorder. There was a low risk that either woman was reoffended again. Woman B was said to show genuine remorse for her crimes, while the judge said there were signs of remorse from Woman P and that they shared a corrupting influence under Watkins. The guidelines in determining Watkins' sentence included the planning and its graphic detail of his crimes, and the deliberate targeting of a vulnerable victim, the abuse of trust in the cases of B and P, the commission of the offenses by 2 people acting together, and the abuse of power in the case of Watkins, along with the commission of offenses whilst under the influence of drugs. The most serious considerations were the fact that a baby was a particularly vulnerable victim. In the case of Watkins, there was more than one victim, along with repeated assaults on the same victim. In addition, the court took into account the degradation through taking photos or videos as part of the offending. The court was unable to determine the effect the abuse would have on Watkins' young victims. but considered it likely they would develop psychological difficulties as a result of coming to terms with what happened. In sentencing the accused, Mr. Justice Royce handed Watkins a 29-year prison term, with eligibility to apply for parole in 2031 after serving 2/3 of his prison term, followed by 6 years of supervised release for a total of 35 years. Woman B was given a 14-year sentence, while Woman P, owing to nature of her enthusiastic complicity in Watkins' crimes, was sentenced to 17 years. A senior investigating officer on the case described Watkins as a committed, organized pedophile, and potentially the most dangerous sex offender he had ever seen. He was sent from HM Prison Park to HM Prison Wakefield to begin serving his sentence. He was later transferred to HM Prison Long Lartin in 2014 in order to be closer to his mother. On October 9, 2017, Watkins was accused of grooming a single, 21-year-old mother from prison through a series of letters. A Lost Prophets fan since she was 16. The young woman from Lincolnshire visited Watkins in prison after he sent her a letter in 2016 in which he claimed to love her. It was also alleged that Watkins made jokes about her 2-year-old watching her have sex. The child was taken into care once social services were alerted that the woman had contacted the pedophile's singer. A spokesperson for the NSBCC said, "We're sickened," adding, "It's utterly bewildering that he could carry on grooming. It shows contempt for children he abused and raises serious questions about supervision." A friend of the mother revealed she visited Watkins in prison in November 2016 and discovered that he had put on 4 stone. His hair had turned gray, and his teeth were rotting. He then allegedly asked if her daughter came into the room during sex. It was at that point the woman said she began to feel scared, but vowed to never let him have any contact with her daughter. After it was discovered that the pair had been communicating, police seized her mobile phone and laptop in December, before taking the child into care. The woman then returned to visit Watkins in January 2018, to inform him of what had happened before coming back again in March. Prison officials in Wakefield, where he had been transferred, reportedly found nothing untoward in their exchanges via letters and emails. In March 2018, Watkins was found to be in possession of a mobile phone and was accused of using it to maintain contact with a girlfriend outside prison, a charge which he denied. A search of his cell produced the charger for the phone. Watkins said the phone belonged to 2 inmates who forced him to hide it for them, but refused to give their names for fear of incurring violent retribution. In August 2019, Watkins attended trial at Leeds Crown Court, during which he claimed to still receive fan mail from Lost Prophets fans, and that the men wanted him to help them take advantage of the women writing in as a revenue stream. Watkins reportedly paid a Liverpool-based gang member for access to the mobile device. He was reportedly paying £1,000 for its use. However, upon being caught with the phone in custody, this amount increased to £5,000. At the conclusion of the 5-day trial, Watkins was convicted and sentenced to a further 10 months in prison, a term that was to run consecutively with his existing sentence at HM Prison Wakefield, where Watkins remained incarcerated. A hostage situation occurred on the morning of August 5, 2023, when 3 inmates held Watkins against his will. He suffered stab wounds, but was freed some 6 hours later by prison officers. It was confirmed by police that his injuries were not life-threatening. The motive for the attack was allegedly a £600 drugs debt owed by Watkins to another prisoner, who used a sharpened toilet brush as a makeshift weapon. Shortly after the incident, Watkins was reported to have spent his time buying both protection and friendships from other inmates, with assistance from family and friends who arranged bank transfers to the inmates. Shortly after, Ian Watkins was charged with 13 sexual offenses against children, including the attempted rape of a 1-year-old girl. The other band members of Lost Prophets posted a message on their website describing how they were learning about the details of the investigation along with you, concluding, "It is a difficult time for us and our families, and we want to thank our fans for their support as we seek answers. All tour dates were subsequently cancelled, and on October 1st, 2013, the band announced they would be disbanding after nearly a year of coming to terms with our heartache. Once Watkins pleaded guilty to his crimes, the band posted a lengthy statement, saying how they were heartbroken, angry, and disgusted. The band members stated that they had been unaware of his many crimes, and that though working with him had become a constant, miserable challenge, they had never imagined him capable of behavior of the type he has now admitted, and urged any other victims to contact the authorities. Immediately after Watkins was sentenced, the BBC banned the entire Lost Prophets back catalog from being played on their station. In years when Ian Watkins was perpetrating his crimes against defenseless children, the police had numerous opportunities to stop him. However, the reports from people such as his ex-girlfriend Joanne Yegelix went unheeded. This was most likely because of his fame, something that has given monsters such as Watkins and Jimmy Savile a certain measure of immunity. It was the immunity from suspicion that allowed Watkins to continue to several years, to corrupt others, and abuse the most vulnerable of victims, all while projecting to the world an image of a professional who was above suspicion. However, behind closed doors, Watkins was revealed to be one of the most degenerate and evil of serial offenders. Case 4. On Florida's death row. Serial killer Ted Bundy attempted to bargain for more time by giving up his secrets to detectives. He offered information on the unsolved murders of young women in several western states during the 1970s, and one of the cases Bundy was questioned about was the death of Sandra Weaver, who was found in Colorado after her abduction from Utah. Born on August 4, 1955, to Marlene and Bruno Weaver in Arcadia, Wisconsin, where she grew up in the family home alongside her 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Weaver attended the Western Wisconsin Technological Institute in La Crosse, and by June 1974 had finished her first year when she decided to travel to Utah with a girlfriend. Weaver and Joan Elkins planned to work for a few weeks before returning home for the fall college term and the marriage of Sandra's sister in late July. The girls hitchhiked to Salt Lake City, Utah, and their found residence at the trailer, home of a young man they had met in Utah. Together they found work at a warehouse in Salt Lake City. On the morning of July 1, 1974, Elkins reported in sick for work, and so Sandra, who was known as Sandy to family and friends, went in alone. She never returned to the trailer, and Elkins said the warehouse called in the afternoon to say that Sandra had not returned to work after she took a lunch break at about 10:30 a.m. Joan Elkins then reported her friend as missing to the Salt Lake City police. She told officers she had no idea where or with whom Sandra may have gone. "We didn't have anybody we knew in Salt Lake City," she said. Elkins then stayed in Utah until mid-August, hoping to find Sandra before returning to Wisconsin. Salt Lake City police had no idea what had happened to 18-year-old Weaver, and initially suspected her disappearance temporary, and that she might reappear. During this time, there were several missing women reported in Washington, but nothing to connect the disappearance of Sandra Weaver to what was happened hundreds of miles away. On July 2, 1974, only a day after Sandra Weaver went missing, a body was discovered by tourists hiking in the Debec Canyon in Colorado at about 3 p.m. near the Colorado River on S6-24, about 16 miles east of Palisade. The woman, found face down in some brush, had been beaten and stripped naked, with no clothing found near the body. It was estimated the young woman was between the ages of 15 and 21 years old, white, between 5 to 7 and 5 to 8 tall, 120 to 135 pounds, with dark, shoulder-length hair and a fair complexion. In addition to the lack of clothing found at the scene, there were no personal effects except for a gold chain with a 1-inch wooden cross and a blue sapphire ring, possibly the most important information, and one that might help police identify. The girl was the contact lenses worn by the victim, which were blue tinted with red identification marks, and her teeth, which indicated extensive dental work. In an effort to identify the woman, Mesa County sheriffs department deputies said the office had gotten a number of inquiries as a result of sent out across the United States. The Montrose pathologist, Dr. Thomas Canfield, conducted further tests in an attempt to learn the actual cause of death. It was determined the girl had been beaten with fists and had died of suffocation, then dragged to the spot in Debec Canyon. After several months of fruitless searching, police eventually identified the Jane Doe. In January 1975, Sheriff's investigator Milo Vig said that dental charts and contact lenses of the victim matched those of Sandra Jean Weaver. When police contacted Sandra's family, her father, Bruno Weaver, confirmed to detectives that his daughter had left home in June 1974 and hitchhiked to Salt Lake City, Utah, to find a summer job. Several months after the disappearance of Sandra Weaver, other young women started to go missing in Utah. In October 1974, 3 young women seemingly vanished. The first, Nancy Wilcox, was never found, while the bodies of 2 others, Melissa Smith and Laura M., were found 9 and 20 days, respectively, after they disappeared. Smith and M had been beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings. Like Weaver, the bodies of Smith and M were found dumped in canyons east of Salt Lake, and all 3 had been found naked and beaten, with May's face beaten beyond recognition by her killer. As a result of these similarities, detectives suspected a connection between these cases and thought as many as 5 murder and an equal number of disappearances might have been committed by the same killer. This serial killer theory was shared by detectives in Washington, where as many as 8 young women had gone missing the previous year, with only scattered remains and bones that might indicate their whereabouts. Captain Pete Hayward of the Salt Lake Sheriff's Department said that officers were checking into the slangs of girls in other western states. These were specifically Wyoming, Nevada, and New Mexico, places where the bodies of young girls have been found, or young women reported missing. In August 1975, over a year after Sandra Weaver had disappeared, and several months after her body had been found, Utah Patrolman Bob Hayward arrested a suspicious young man in a Salt Lake City suburb. The man was identified as Ted Bundy, a student at the University of Utah Law School, and was driving a Volkswagen Beetle, a vehicle that was described as being at the scene of 2 abductions of young women that occurred on the same day at Lake Sammamish State Park in July 1974. The women, Janice OTT and Denise Naslund, were never found. At the time of his capture, Bundy was on a list of suspects that contained the names of Volkswagen owners named Ted, as well as suspected sex offenders. In his Volkswagen Beetle, police found number items such as a ski mask, rope, a pair of handcuffs, a crowbar, and a pantyhose mask. These items were described as a murder kit. Bundy had moved to Utah in September 1974, several months after the disappearance of Sandra Weaver. Ted Bundy was eventually charged with the attempted kidnapping of Carol Duranche and sentenced to between 1 and 15 years. This was not the end of Bundy's legal problems, and he was soon being investigated over the murder of nurse Karen Campbell, who was abducted from a Snowmass ski resort in January 1975. After his second escape from confinement, Bundy traveled to Florida in 1978, where he was suspected of orchestrating the Chi Omega murders and the kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. For these crimes, Bundy would eventually be sentenced to death during 2 separate trials. On death row, Bundy steadfastly refused to admit to his crimes, despite his many admissions to the FBI about his knowledge of serial murder and offer of assistance in the then unsolved Green River Killer investigation. As his execution date approached, Bundy tried desperately to gain more time by confessing to crimes. After his execution in January 1989, details began to emerge of the crimes Bundy made confessions of his involvement. One of those was the Sandra Weaver case, which investigators had long suspected Bundy of committing. Mesa County Sheriff's Lieutenant Rick Clausen said after Bundy's death, Bundy did not confess to Weaver's disappearance. There was talk of him murdering a woman in Utah and then taking her to Colorado, but there was nothing to tie it to Weaver. This admission matched the circumstances of Sandra Weaver's abduction and murder. However, there was never any evidence that connected Bundy to her case, apart from Bundy's taped confession. On that tape, Bundy was interviewed by Detective Dennis Couch and other investigators, who said the serial killer gave Couch specific names, dates, and places on some Utah murders, and gave less detailed information on others. Bundy has given information, he said, that there were a total of 8 Utah victims, said Utah Sheriff Pete Hayward. Bundy talked in specifics about the 5 cases we pointed out to him, but beyond that I don't want to comment at this time. Clausen later said that he heard nothing more than rumors that Bundy had confessed to killing Weaver. Bundy was a consideration at the time, Clausen said. We knew he had been in the area around that time because of a gas receipt. We were quite certain he was involved in the murder of a different girl. At the time we couldn't really pin the Weaver murder on him. With Ted Bundy's death and his refusal to confess directly to the murder of Sandra Weaver, her murder remains unknown. However, there are reportedly no other suspects considered in her case. Case 5. During his death row confessions, serial killer Ted Bundy gave investigators details on many murder cases for which he was suspected of committing, but never charged. One of those was of missing high school student Lynette Culver, who disappeared in Pocatello, Idaho, on May 6, 1975. And who was long thought to be a victim of another suspected serial killer. Originally born in Washington State on July 31, 1962, Lynette Dawn Culver grew up in Pocatello, Idaho, where she lived with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Culver, at 237 Fairbanks. A 7th grader at Alameda Junior High, Lynette was described by her family as a typical preteen, while her teachers knew her as a good student who sometimes liked to skip class. On the afternoon of May 6, 1975, Lynette disappeared. The last time anyone saw her, she was last seen leaving her school during her lunch break, during which she reportedly boarded a bus, Hawthorne Junior High, a journey that would take her to Fort Hall, reported missing after she failed to return to school. Investigators were unable to determine why Lynette would go to Fort Hall. She was described as 5 feet 2 inches tall, with blue eyes and long brown hair, and weighing about 105 pounds. Although only 12, Lynette was, by all accounts, older in appearance. On the day of her disappearance, she was known to be wearing blue jeans and a red checkered shirt with a maroon fur-collared jacket. There were never any reports about Culver's whereabouts, and investigators could take the case no further without proof that she had been either kidnapped and held against her will or murdered. The body of Lynette Culver was never found, and police had no idea what happened to the young schoolgirl. Around the same time, serial killer Ted Bundy was kidnapping and killing young women throughout the states of Washington, Utah, and Colorado. His victim of choice was almost always a young college-aged woman, pretty, with her hair parted in the middle. However, there were several factors what led detectives to believe that Bundy was not responsible for the disappearance of Culver. Bundy's victims were always much older than Culver, who, at 12, would have been his youngest victim up to that point in his murder spree. This, coupled with the fact that he had not, to the knowledge of law enforcement, ventured into Idaho in search of potential victims. He had started in Washington State before moving to Utah and then expanding into Colorado when police began to link his crimes to a single perpetrator. Several years after the disappearance of Lynette, there were a rash of other missing girls in Pocatello that police suspected might have been connected to Culver. Although these disappearances occurred many years after, it was believed that each of the young girls had met their end at the hands of the same killer. 15-year-old Patricia Campbell had last been seen at Alameda Park in Pocatello, Idaho, on July 22nd, 1978. That day, the park was the location of a Pioneer Day celebration, and coincidentally, another girl, 12-year-old Tina Anderson, disappeared in the park that same day. Although the girls did know each other, it was reported they were not close friends. After Tina failed to show up at a babysitting job that evening, across the street from the park, family members reported the girls missing to the Pocatello Police Department. 3 years later, another young girl went missing. 14-year-old Linda Smith was abducted from her Pocatello home at 239 8th on June 14, 1981. While babysitting her 9-year-old brother, an unknown man had rushed into the family home at around 2 in the morning, dragging Linda out of her bedroom and into his vehicle. Her younger brother described the unknown man as white, and said he had his arm wrapped around Linda, who was kicking and screaming, trying to get away, before being shoved into a van with white flames painted on the sides. Despite the description of the abductor, police had little to go on, and little progress was made in the case. They suspected Linda has merely run away from home, even when Linda's clothes were found in a ditch a week later by a city employee. Police still did not believe she was the victim of a kidnapping. The following May, 11 months after she was last seen, remains were found below Hospital Way on a hilly area near East Center Street in Pocatello. They were positively identified as those of the missing Linda Smith. The cause of death was never determined. The Smith family believed that the investigation had been botched from the start. Later that same year, on October 15, 1981, some partial remains were discovered when hunters stumbled upon bones about 60 miles away in rural Oneida County. Clothing found was identified as belonging to Patricia was also found at the scene. At the scene, the sheriff's office also retrieved .22 caliber bullet casings. Missing Tina Anderson would soon be identified through dental records. However, the other remains thought to be Patricia's could not be positively identified. With one girl missing and the remains of 2 others found, police began looking into the theory that these cases were somehow connected and that an unidentified serial killer might be responsible. On June 5, 1983, another young girl went missing. Sometime between the hours of 11:45 p.m. and 1:45 a.m. 14-year-old Cindy Bringhurst vanished while babysitting at an apartment in the 100 block of Highland Boulevard, Pocatello. The following month in July, her body was found by a fisherman partially submerged in a stream in the Mink Creek area west of Pocatello. Cindy had graduated from Alameda Junior High School, the same school which Lynette Culver was attending when she went missing. As in the case of the other missing girl, detectives were unable to determine what happened to Cindy. 3 years later, on October 26, 1986, a partial skull lacking, a mandible was discovered by hunters in the same area as the remains belonging to of Tina and the still unidentified young girl believed to be Patricia Campbell. An examination of the skull indicated that the victim died due to being repeatedly struck with a blunt object. She was determined to have been white and aged between 12 and 16 years. After this, the skull was misplaced by law enforcement and was unable to be located for years until it resurfaced in 2018. In 2006, the Oneida County Sheriff's Office began to search for the unidentified remains found in 1981. At some point during this search, the remains were rediscovered in the department's evidence storage area. DNA testing was performed on these remains, and they were confirmed to be Patricia's in March 2007. Efforts to help identify the skull found in 1986 began in 2021 with the assistance of Othram. DNA testing eventually confirmed the skull belonged to Patricia in October 2022. The murders of the 4 young Pocatello girls between 1978 and 1983 have never been solved, although in recent years police have come to suspect they might not have been committed by the same killer. In the years since Lynette Culver's disappearance and the discovery of the remains of the missing Idaho girls, Ted Bundy went on to commit further murders in Florida. There, On February 9th, 1978, he kidnapped and killed 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, who would be his youngest victim, long suspected of targeting only adult victims. The revelation that Bundy raped and murdered Leach then opened up the possibility that he might be responsible for claiming younger victims. However, with Ted Bundy on death row, he steadfastly refused to admit to his crimes, protesting only that he was innocent. Meanwhile, at the same time, he gave detailed interviews to journalists on his suspected crimes, and talking about murder in the third person. So as to prevent him from prosecution, Bundy remained a suspect in Culver's disappearance. Finally, during his last days, before his scheduled execution, Bundy decided to use his victims in a last-ditch attempt to buy himself more time. He believed he could use details of his unsolved crimes as bargaining chips with detectives, in the hopes that it would prolong his life. Although Bundy did confess to crimes he was never convicted, his execution date was not postponed. He went on to confess to as many as 20 murders of young women throughout Washington, Utah, Colorado, Oregon, and Idaho. One of those Bundy talked about in Idaho was Lynette Culver, and he made a startling admission. Ted Bundy went on to describe how on May 6, 1975, he was parked outside of the Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho, 160 miles. 255 kilometers north of Salt Lake City. He said he saw a young girl walking along by herself and decided to try and lure her into his vehicle, a Volkswagen Beetle that had been used in his previous crimes. Once Culver accepted a ride, he drove her to his Holiday Inn hotel room. There, he said he raped Culver before drowning her in the bathtub. Bundy said he disposed of her body in the Snake River north of Pocatello. If detectives were still dubious about this admission, Bundy gave them more by reportedly provided intimate details about Lynette's personal life in his confession. Police would get no further time to question Bundy, as his time had run out. On January 24, 1989, he was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison for the murder of Kimberly Leach. With his confession, police believed that Lynette had fallen victim to Bundy, a cold-blooded serial killer who claimed the lives of as many as 30 young women. Case 6. On a warm autumn evening in 1961, 8-year-old Annemarie Burr went to bed along with her younger sibling. Several hours later, she woke to tell her mother that her young sibling was crying, and the two children were settled back to sleep. It was the last time her parents saw her. At some point in the night, little Annemarie Burr vanished. It appeared someone had entered the Burr home that night and snatched Annemarie from her bed, taking her into the night. The police investigation saw several suspects questioned, but none were arrested for the crime. The prime suspect in the disappearance of Annemarie Burr is the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. Born in Del Norte County, California, on December 14, 1952, Annemarie Burr grew up the eldest of 4 into a Catholic family. Her parents, Donald and Beverly Burr, had 2 other daughters, Julie and Mary, and a son named Gregory. By the early 1960s, the Burr family resided in the North End neighborhood of Tacoma, Washington, located at 3009 North 14th Street. Beverly Burr tried to teach her children that the world was a good and safe place. She later told the Seattle Times that, and was so trusting and she regretting not telling her daughter about how dangerous the world can be at times. It was a big mistake. We taught her everyone was good. We didn't teach them that people could be bad. I still think her abductor was probably someone she knew. The evening of August 30th, 1961, was like any other in the Burr household. Young and Marie had earlier eaten dinner at the home of nearby friend, and she and her 3 siblings were put to bed by their parents at around 8 p.m., and Marie shared a bedroom with her 3-year-old sister Mary, while her other siblings shared a basement bedroom. During the course of the evening, the Burrs said they could hear their pet Cocker Spaniel barking at something or someone. It is unknown if this was investigated by Donald Burr. At some point during the early morning hours, and Marie woke her parents in their first-floor bedroom to complain that Mary was crying. and Marie's younger sibling was suffering from a broken arm, which was in a cast, and their mother Beverly had to soothe her back to sleep. Soon both girls were back asleep in bed. When later questioned, Beverly Burr could no recall the time when Marie had awoken her parents, but it would have been before 5 a.m. At approximately 5:30 a.m., Beverly Burr was woken by Mary, crying, and, upon reaching their bedroom, discovered that Anne-Marie was missing. When they frantically searched the house, they found the front door, which had been locked, was left slightly ajar. There was also a small window in the living room that had been left open. On the floor inside the house, they found grass from the front lawn and realized that someone had entered the house from outside. When they checked the children in the basement, they found them safe and still sleeping. Once Donald Burr went outside, he could see a bench had been overturned and was resting against the side of the house. When law enforcement arrived at the Burr family home, they found evidence that an intruder had been inside the house. Outside, they found a faint footprint, estimated to have been made by a size 6 or 7 kid sneaker, near the overturned bench, which indicated that someone had entered the home through an open living room window. However, a table of figurines beside the window had been left undisturbed. Inside Burr's bedroom, none of her clothing or personal effects were missing. At the time of her disappearance, Anne-Marie Burr had been sleeping, and so was wearing only her blue nightgown and a chain necklace with an engraved medal of the Madonna and Child, a medal of St. Christopher, and an identification tag. That same morning she was reported missing. A search party of 100 soldiers from Fort Lewis, as well as 50 members of the National Guard from Camp Murray, aided local police in the search for the child. Throughout the course of the day, and up to 11 p.m., over 75 square blocks that surrounded the Burr residence had been searched. This included residential and woodland areas, but uncovered no sign of the child. In the event that Anna Mori had ended up in water, dive teams searched Commencement Bay, but found nothing. The FBI became involved in the case only on a standby basis, owing to the lack of evidence that pointed towards an abduction. One neighbor came forward to report that screaming could be heard coming from a vehicle with California license plates on the morning Burr went missing. However, the driver of this vehicle was located, and they explained that the noise had originated from the radio and was likely mistaken for screaming. From the beginning of the investigation, there were suspicions that Burr's parents had withheld vital information about their daughter's disappearance. In response, Donald and Beverly Burr voluntarily took polygraph examinations on September 8, 1961. The results found that both parents had been truthful in their responses. The following day, Burr's maternal grandmother, Mrs. Roy Leach, posted a $1,000 reward for information leading to the discovery of her granddaughter, and after the allocation of additional funds, the reward was increased to $5,000. While the investigation progressed, police began looking at potential suspects. Within the first 12 days of Anne-Marie Burr's disappearance, over 1,500 people were interviewed. One of those was a teenage neighbor of the Burrs, who failed one polygraph, but later passed another. Police looked at local sex offenders who had recently been released from prison, believing this was the likely motivation if she had been kidnapped. A 31-year-old ex-Marine, Hugh Byron Morse, was questioned on October 21, 1961. Morse had been a suspect in the 1959 disappearance of 9-year-old Candy Rogers in Spokane, whose body was found 3 weeks after she went missing, under similar circumstances to Anne-Marie Burr. Rogers was found raped and strangled with a piece of her own clothing. In what police considered a significant lead occurred in June 1962, when they received a report from an employee at a service station in Portage La Prairie, Manitoba, Canada, who told investigators that he saw a girl who resembled Burr and who mentioned she was from Tacoma, accompanied by a man and woman who reportedly spoke a little too sharply for them to be her parents. One man, who was later found to have no connection to her disappearance, was charged with disorderly conduct after trying to collect a ransom for an inmate in Oklahoma later claimed that he and a friend were behind the kidnapping of Anna Mari while they were working in Tacoma. He claimed to have buried her in a field. However, nothing was found when police excavated the site. Another suspect surfaced in the winter of 1964, when police attempted to arrest Ralph Everett Larkey in Portland, Oregon. Larkey, an auto parts salesman from Spokane, had been accused of kidnapping Gay Lynn Stewart, a 10-year-old girl from Tacoma. The suspect admitted to picking up the young girl, telling police that he took her for through the Pacific Northwest, and then dropped her off a few days later. When law enforcement and FBI agents raided his home, Ralph Everett Larkey shot himself with a pistol just as officers knocked on his door. Owing to his suicide, police never got the chance to question Larkey, and his involvement with the disappearance of Anna Mari Burr was never established beyond his preferred victim type. One of the most high-profile suspects in the Burr case was the then-incarcerated serial killer Ted Bundy. Throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, the Anna Mari Burr case grew cold until nothing more was reported about the missing child. However, that changed in the 1980s, when Bundy let slip an interesting story. When Ted Bundy was on death row being interviewed by journalists Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth, Bundy told them about killing a young girl in an orchard. However, it was not clear at the time if this story was something Bundy had heard about from another inmate, or something he himself had done. When investigators looked into Bundy's early years, they found that he had grew up close to the Burr home in Tacoma. This admission by the notorious serial killer set off alarms, bells, and soon enough this story featured in the press. Beverly Ann's mother read the story and decided to write to Bundy and ask him about her missing daughter. Ted wrote back a reply which in part said, "First and foremost, I do not know what happened to your daughter Anne-Marie. I had nothing to do with her disappearance. You said she disappeared August 31st, 1961. At the time I was a normal 14-year-old boy. I did not wander the streets late at night. I did not steal cars. I had absolutely no desire to harm anyone. I was just an average kid. For your sake you really must understand this." Although he had denied any involvement in Anne-Marie Burr's disappearance, Bundy reportedly told the story again during an interview with a professor not long afterwards. When it came to confessions, Bundy often dabbled with the truth in an attempt to avoid incriminating himself, and he often gave different answers, depending on the interviewer. In his later death row confessions, Bundy always maintained that he began his murders after 1969, during the 1970s. If he did commit the kidnapping and murder of the Burr child, it would have been his first murder when he was himself only a child. Detectives decided this could be a plausible theory and began looking into Bundy's childhood. At the time of Burr's disappearance, Bundy was only 14 and worked as a paperboy. His delivery route included the neighborhood of the Burr's residence. Bundy would have needed to cross very near to the Burr residence, as he had to pass 6th Avenue and N5 streets, where the office manager for the route was the unknown sized 6 shoe imprint found outside the window, from which Burr was abducted, was consistent with a teenage perpetrator. He had other connections to the area, with a great-uncle, whom he often visited, who taught music at the University of Puget Sound, which was located several blocks from the Burr residence. Based on this circumstantial evidence, Burr's parents believed their daughter was buried on the University of Puget Sound campus. When detectives questioned Bundy about Burr's disappearance, he told them he wouldn't have hurt a little girl and denied involvement. When he was questioned by Bob Keppel about his crimes, Bundy reportedly told him there were some murders that he would never talk about because they were committed too close to home, too close to family, or involved victims who were very young. For Keppel and other detectives, Burr's disappearance matched all 3 of these categories. Anne-Marie Burr's parents said publicly that they, nor their daughter, had known Ted Bundy when he was a teenager. Beverly Burr stated that, after exchanging 2 letters with Bundy while he was on death row, he avoided the real questions talking instead about the Green River murders and world events. Burr's parents would go on to tell the media that they believed their daughter's body had been buried in excavation sites on the UPS campus, where construction was underway in 1961. Burr's father also later told crime writer and Rule that he believed he remembered seeing Bundy in a ditch on the UPS campus the morning of his daughter's disappearance. Bundy was executed in January 1989 without ever admitting to Burr's murder. The FBI CODIS database, or Combined DNA Index System, in Washington did not contain Ted Bundy's DNA sample, although he was suspected of many murders of young women. In Washington state, he had never been convicted of a crime there, so as a result his DNA was never uploaded to the Washington CODIS. In September 2011, Bundy's DNA sample was finally uploaded into the Florida CODIS database, and evidence from the Burr crime scene was tested against his DNA in order to establish a connection. However, the testing failed because a full DNA profile could not be produced from the evidence. The rumors of Ted Bundy's involvement in the disappearance of Annemarie Burr had persisted over the years, and the Burrs consider him the prime suspect. In July 1963, Donald and Beverly Burr adopted an infant girl and remained in Tacoma until their deaths. They would never get closure on the case of their missing daughter, and the mystery surrounding the circumstances of Annemarie Burr's death might never be known. Case 7. When serial killer Ted Bundy was sentenced to his third death sentence, he found himself imprisoned at Stark Prison in Florida, with Ted Bundy on death row. The authorities questioned him on unsolved cases and hoped he would finally reveal the whereabouts and divulge what happened to his many victims, most of whom were never found. During his later years on death row, Bundy helped authorities with the Green River Killer investigation and eventually made his confessions. However, one thing Ted Bundy always thought about was escape, and even on death row, he attempted at least one plan to gain his freedom. Towards the end of the 1980s, Bundy's execution date was cancelled and rescheduled until his final date with Old Sparky, on January 7, 1980. Ted Bundy would go on trial for the last time for the murder of Kimberly Leach, the 12-year-old Lake City Junior High School student, who was kidnapped on February 9, 1978. During the trial, during which Bundy conducted his own defense, the evidence was stacked against him. In the courtroom, the suave Bundy married his longtime girlfriend Carol Boone during a brief ceremony. Found guilty, the verdict was handed down on February 10, 1980, and Bundy was sentenced for a third time to death by electrocution. When he heard this, he stood up and shouted, "Tell the jury they were wrong." 3 days later, Bundy was taken to the Florida State Prison in Rayford, and there had his mugshot taken, and was formally condemned as a death row inmate. At the conclusion of the Leach trial, Bundy was sent to Stark Prison in Rayford, where he began his sentence on death row in February 1980 as inmate number 69,063. On February 13, 1980, he was processed into the prison system with his mugshot taken and prison clothes issued. During his time there, Bundy initially occupied a cell on the 2 North Catwalk. From his first days at Rayford, Ted Bundy, the notorious serial killer, became something of a celebrity inmate, with many visitors to the prison often asking to see him. The normally socially confident Bundy intensely disliked being made a crowd pleaser, believing the prison authorities were treating him like a prison tourist attraction. When on trial for his crimes, Bundy enjoyed the attention from female fans, particularly his Bundy groupies, who were often to be seen sitting in the front row. Now on death row, Bundy always received more mail than any other inmate, usually around 20 to 30 letters a day from people all around the world. Most of those who wrote him just wanted a souvenir if he replied, but some were from women who professed their love and admiration for him, and he even got proposals of marriage. One woman who stuck by him through his trials and time on death row was Caroline Boone, who had met the serial killer in Washington in 1974, and later became his wife during the Leach trial. although conjugal visitation was not allowed at the Florida State Prison. Many of the inmates were known to pool their money to bribe the guards to allow them intimate time alone with their female visitors. On October 24, 1982, Boone had birthed to Ted Bundy's daughter, Rose Bundy. Boone remained loyal to Bundy until his later confessions to his many crimes, beginning in March 1980, shortly after he had been sent to death row. Bundy participated in a series of interviews with journalists and investigative reporters Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth. The purpose of the interviews was to give Bundy the opportunity to speak with them in collaboration on a book about himself, although Bundy had always denied his crimes, claiming he was not a serial killer. The interviews gave him an opportunity to confess to his crimes by giving a third-person perspective on how he believed the killer had murdered so many young women in Washington, Utah, Idaho, and Florida. On 4 different interview days in April 1980, Bundy speculated to Michaud and Ainsworth, Hollanda and Healy, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball and Nancy Wilcox were all abducted, placed inside his Volkswagen Beetle and murdered. Further interviews were conducted on November 12, 1980, and February 5, 1981, while the last took place on March 31, 1981. By the end, Michaud and Ainsworth had enough material to publish their book, The Only Living Witness, which was described as one of the best true crime books ever written. A second book, titled Ted Bundy, Conversations with a Killer, contained edited transcripts of the interviews. While his time spent on death row was mostly spent in his cell, replying to letters, Bundy was known to be a troublesome inmate. He seemed to take great delight in defying the authorities at every opportunity. On October 14, 1980, a date between his meetings with Michaud and Ainsworth, an officer cleaning up food trays after lunch found Bundy's tray with a hole burned in it. Bundy denied the charge and had to pay $4 for the tray while his privileges were revoked. For 15 days, Ted Bundy had a history to defying the prison system ruled. During the Chi Omega trial, Bundy refused to attend court on July 17, 1979. The jailer, SGT Marty Kratz, explained to the judge that, at about 1 a.m., Ted had thrown an orange between the bars of cell 406 and succeeded in smashing one of the lights installed outside to give him better illumination in his cell. Jailers had immediately moved him to cell 405 and searched his cell. Hidden far back in that cell, they had found shards of broken glass from the splintered light bulb, SGT Kratz said. When we went to get him for court this morning, we couldn't get the key in the lock. He jammed some toilet paper in there. Reminded that he was due in court, Bundy said, "I'll be there when I feel like it." On September 14, 1979, a correctional officer saw several magazine pictures pasted on the walls of Bundy's cell, a violation of prison rules. When the officer asked Bundy to remove them, he refused, saying, "The pictures are on the wall since I have no TV." At a hearing the next month, Bundy pleaded not guilty to the violation, adding that he wanted to brighten up his cell. His exercise privileges were revoked for 30 days. On death row, Bundy continued to cause problems for the guards. On February 2, 1983, 2 officers found water flooding the cell block where Bundy and other inmates were housed. Bundy was charged with disorderly conduct after officials determined he caused the flooding by repeatedly flushing his toilet. Bundy pleaded not guilty. His privileges were revoked for 30 days. While most of Bundy's misbehavior on death row was innocuous, and could even be considered as pranks by a bored inmate, which seemed focused more towards causing the guards and warden more paperwork. One particular incident that took place in 1984 was cause for concern by the prison authorities. Were overseeing the imprisonment of a man with a record of successful escapes. By mid-1984, Bundy was moved up to R Wing 3 North and proceeded to keep his head down, quietly going about his business. During one evening shift on July 18, 1984, the Rayford guards decided to beat the bars. which was a security precaution that involved officers striking the metal bars of all the inmates' cells with a rubber mallet to detect any cutting or tampering. After the first cell had been checked, the wing sergeant struck the bars on cell number 2, and the sound of cold steel hit the floor and rolled out onto the quarterdeck. They realized they had been cut. The death row prisoner was cuffed and secured in the nearby shower cell. Then the same sound could be heard from cell number 3. This was Bundy's cell. Instantly our pucker factor went off the chart, and a frightening feel set over us. How many cells were like this up here? We asked ourselves. It scared the hell out of us. Bundy was quickly handcuffed, and the sergeant ordered the wings sealed off, and additional assistance was requested. It was determined only 2 of the cells were tampered with, and it was learned Ted Bundy and the other inmate had formulated a plan to escape by taking the midnight shift officers hostage. Bundy had managed to keep 2 hacksaw blades hidden in his cell, and the steel bars had been sawn through at the top and bottom, then glued back into place with an adhesive made from soap. He was subsequently moved to a different cell, and several months later a mirror was found in his cell, which was unauthorized, and he was again relocated. He entered into unauthorized correspondence with another criminal, John Hinckley Jr., and was again disciplined for this infraction. It was during this period that Bundy was attacked by several other death row inmates in what was described as a gang rape. However, Bundy would strenuously deny having been assaulted. After several years of Ted Bundy on death row, the incarcerated serial killer read about the then still unsolved series of murders attributed to the Green River Killer, and decided to write to Detective Bob Keppel on October 1, 1984, offering his help in the Green River investigation. With his unique insight, Keppel and Dave Reichert, the lead detective on the Green River Task Force, decided to take Bundy up on his offer. Bundy believed he alone could help detectives catch the unidentified Green River Killer, owing to his own experience with serial murder. To Keppel and Reichert, Bundy offered a unique insight into the mind of the killer, which to Keppel seemed a curious offer, considering that Bundy had never confessed to any of his own crimes, and still denied he was a serial killer. Several weeks after sending his letter, Keppel and Reichert traveled to the Florida State Penitentiary, and there met with Bundy in a small interrogation room off death row. Although Bundy could never provide Keppel with enough information to help catch the killer, he did offer many insightful opinions on how the killer might operate. He spoke about how the Riverman, as he described the killer, might be selecting his victims, how long the killer might have been operating, the reason he was dumping bodies in different places, and he often lectured the 2 detectives on they should conduct their investigation. Keppel would make several more trips to see Bundy over the next few years, and not only in relation to the Green River Killer, but also to get Bundy to confess his own crime. Sometime in August 1986, 5 sketches that were alleged to have been drawn by Ted Bundy were delivered to an unknown source. These 5 drawings depicted a variety of images, each of which conveyed different emotions that the artist intended to express. The first, known as Me, depicts a figure with strong angular features dressed in stylish clothes. This is the image Bundy wanted to present to people, and could be considered his fake Ted. The second, known as The Entity, was a representation of his dark side. It shows a warrior wearing a helmet and wielding an axe, which could be the true Ted, used to metaphorically describe the emotions and rage that he tried to hide from the world. The third was Handcuffs, and showed a man wearing restraints. This could be an indication of how Bundy saw himself in relation to admitting to his guilt, and how his hands were tied in his refusal to confess. The fourth was Big Fish, and contained strong connections to his view on serial killers, and how there are many small fish that the FBI will catch, but every now and then they will capture a big fish, such as Bundy and the Riverman. The fifth and last drawing was titled Freedom, and is one of the more complex renditions of the entire set. It shows a woman with long hair, similar to his many victims, along with a large sword, a hooded figure, and a skull beneath the woman. It contains the most overtly sexual imagery. However, its interpretation is not as easily explained and is open to debate. Bundy once said to investigators about confessing to his crimes, "Walking right up to the edge is a thrill, but I can't do it. I haven't allowed myself to choke." For more than a decade, he had insisted on his own innocence. So much so, that his family, and even Carol Boone, believed he had been wrongly convicted for crimes he never committed. Boone would stay by his side almost until the end. In the last few years of his time on death row, Bundy formed a somewhat complicated if unusual relationship with FBI Special Agent William "Bill" Hagmaier. He first met Ted Bundy in 1984, when he helped the Green River investigation. Bundy seemed to confide in Hagmaier, telling the FBI agent about his innermost thoughts and feelings on serial murder. But even to Hagmaier, Bundy refused to confess. Sitting there in a cell, I could convince myself that I was not guilty of anything. As his execution date grew nearer, Bundy attempted to gain more time by giving up details about murders for which he had not been convicted. He told Hagmaier about the murder of Melissa Smith in Utah. In October 1974, he confessed to decapitating the young girl and taking her head home with him to his Utah apartment. There, he spent the evening applying makeup to Smith's face. At the same time, he washed the hair of another victim, Laura M., whose head he had kept after her murder. He told Hagmaier, "If you've got time, can be anyone you want them to be." With his execution date set, Bundy told detectives from Utah, Colorado, and Idaho that he had committed numerous other murders for which he had never been charged, hoping to get another stay of execution. He withheld many details and sought to use the information as a bargaining chip in his effort to remain alive. In the end, he confessed to the murders of 30 women throughout Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. Hagmaier asked Bundy if 36 was an appropriate number of victims. He said, "Add one more digit, and you have it." Some investigators suspect that Bundy was responsible for as many as 100 unsolved murders, but there has never been any evidence to support this. Facing death in the electric chair for his crimes, the time of Ted Bundy on death row was marked by an erratic, and at times, indeterminate execution date. On March 4, 1985, an execution date for the Chi Omega convictions is set. However, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a brief stay of execution. This did not last long, and a new execution date was quickly rescheduled. In April 1986, a new execution date, July 2, 1986, was announced. And Bundy finally began making confessions to his lawyer, Polly Nelson, and FBI Special Agent Bill Hagmaier on July 1, 1986, less than 15 hours before the scheduled execution date. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals stayed indefinitely and remanded the Chi Omega case for review on multiple technicalities, this including Bundy's mental competency to stand trial and an erroneous instruction by the trial judge during the penalty phase requiring the jury to break a 6-6 tie between life imprisonment and the death penalty. On November 18, 1986, Bundy obtains a stay of execution only 7 hours before he is scheduled to die over the next 3 years. No further dates are set until January 1989, when Florida Governor Bob Martinez signed Bundy's 4th death warrant. On January 22nd, Bundy has one last meeting with Keppel and Hagmaier. His execution date was set for January 25th. On that morning, Bundy called Carol Boone. However, she refused to take his call after hearing of his confessions. With his appeals exhausted, and the families of the victims refusing to stay, petitioned Governor Martinez for a stay of execution, Bundy talked of suicide. The morning of January 25th, at 7:16 a.m., the execution of Ted Bundy was carried out. People outside cheered when news of his death was announced, and many held up placards with "Burn Bundy." Burn in celebration at the passing of one of the most notorious of serial killers. 8. The story of Colleen Stan is a harrowing tale of survival. and resilience. Known as the girl in the box, Stan endured a horrific 7-year captivity at the hands of her kidnappers, Cameron and Janice Hooker, before finally escaping in 1984. Her ordeal stands as one of the most shocking cases of prolonged captivity in modern history. On May 19, 1977, 20-year-old Colleen Stan was hitchhiking from her home in Eugene, Oregon, to a friend's birthday party in Northern California. She was an experienced hitchhiker and felt confident in her ability to judge character. When Cameron and Janice Hooker, a seemingly normal couple with a baby, offered her a ride, she accepted, believing she was safe. However, shortly after she got into their van, Cameron Hooker pulled off the highway, threatening Stan with a knife and placing a homemade wooden box over her head, effectively blindfolding and silencing her. They took her to their home in Red Bluff, California, where she was subjected to unimaginable torture and psychological manipulation. Cameron Hooker, a sadistic and controlling man, kept Stan in a coffin-like box underneath the couple's bed for up to 23 hours a day. The box was soundproof and designed to restrict movement, isolating her from the outside world and breaking her spirit. Hooker manipulated Stan into believing he was part of a powerful and dangerous organization called the Company that would kill her and her family if she tried to escape. For the first few months, Stan was regularly tortured, raped, and brainwashed. Cameron Hooker forced her to sign a slavery contract and renamed her Kay, further stripping her of her identity and autonomy. Hooker's wife, Janice, played a complex role in the captivity. She was both a participant in and a victim of her husband's abusive behavior, initially agreeing to the kidnapping as a means to control his sadistic urges. As the years went by, Stan's life of terror continued. However, she was occasionally allowed some freedoms, such as visiting her family under the strict condition she would not reveal her true situation. Remarkably, despite the presence of her captors, Stan adhered to these conditions due to the deep psychological control Hooker had over her. The turning point in Stan's captivity came in 1984, when Janice Hooker, struggling with her own sense of guilt and fear, confessed to Stan that the company was a fabrication. This revelation shattered the psychological chains that had kept Stan from escaping. With Janice's help, Stan finally fled the Hooker household on August 10, 1984. She contacted her family, and Janice went to the police, leading to Cameron Hooker's arrest. The trial of Cameron Hooker in 1985 brought the harrowing details of Stan's ordeal to light. Janice testified against her husband in exchange for immunity. Cameron Hooker was convicted of multiple charges, including kidnapping, rape, and sexual assault. He was sentenced to 104 years in prison. Colleen Stan's resilience and bravery in the face of unimaginable horror have been widely recognized. After her escape, she sought to rebuild her life advocating for victims of abuse and captivity. Her story has been recounted in books, documentaries, and interviews, serving as a powerful testament to human endurance and the capacity to overcome even the darkest of circumstances. Today, Colleen Stan is a symbol of survival and strength. Her experience underscores the importance of vigilance and support for victims of abuse, highlighting the psychological complexities involved in prolonged captivity. The legacy of her ordeal continues to resonate, reminding us of the profound impact of trauma and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Case 9. During the 1970s, serial killer Ted Bundy was the prime suspect in many unsolved cases of missing women. Although he was only charged with a relatively small number of killings, it is believed Bundy murdered roughly 20 young women and girls between 1974 and 1978. He is suspected in as many as 30 to 100 more homicides, including the unsolved murder of Melanie Cooley. A young student, Cooley was last seen hitchhiking in the area of Netherland, Colorado. In April 1975, around this time, Bundy was largely moved away from Utah, where he had claimed the lives of as many as 8 women and had begun to hunt for victims in Colorado. Despite circumstantial evidence pointing to his guilt, Bundy was never charged with his heinous crime. On April 6, 1975, a young woman vanished from Grand Junction, Colorado. 24-year-old Denise Lynn Oliverson went missing while cycling to her parents' house. She was not the first woman who fell victim to an unseen killer in Colorado. Several months earlier in January, a young nurse by the name of Karen Campbell was found beaten to death after going missing in Snowmass, Colorado. What the authorities in Colorado did not know was that an elusive killer was hunting lone women, much the same way he had done in Utah and Washington before that. Just over a week after Denise Oliverson went missing, another young woman vanished. On April 15, 1975, 18-year-old Melanie Suzanne Cooley left Netherland High School, where she was a senior. Cooley was born in Boulder, but grew up in Netherland and knew the area well. Known as Susie to her friends, she was last seen by classmates after her classes were over, hitchhiking nearby in Netherland, something she was known to do often, despite the dangers. Her disappearance was reported to police, and a description was given of Cooley, who was last seen wearing blue jeans, a blue jean jacket with an embroidered eagle on the back, and tan-colored boots. On Friday, May 2, 1975, a body was found by a road maintenance worker in Coal Creek Canyon. It was later identified as that of Melanie Cooley, born October 27, 1956 in Boulder, Colorado. According to the coroner, she had been hit over the head repeatedly with a large rock, which caused massive head injuries that caused her death. A large rock was found near the body, and it was suspected this had been the murder weapon. Curiously, it was determined she had been dead for about 2 weeks when her body was found, but 3 days after her disappearance. This would seem to indicate her killer had kept Cooley captive for several days before finally carrying out the killing. By early 1975, Ted Bundy had begun to venture farther east, beyond his Utah hunting grounds towards Colorado, where several young women had gone missing. Not all of the Colorado victims associated with Ted Bundy vanished without trace. The body of Karen Campbell was located almost 5 weeks after her death. The others, however, disappeared, and their bodies were never found. Ted Bundy has long been suspected in the death of Melanie Cooley by detectives. According to credit card receipts, Bundy filled up his Volkswagen Beetle with gas at Golden, Colorado, on the same day Cooley went missing. Golden is not far from Netherland, the location of the crime. Bundy purchased gas at other places in Colorado, such as Silverthorne, during the same month when the other women were abducted. It is likely that Bundy was actively searching for victims in Colorado after the investigation into the disappearances of 8 young women in Utah caused him to relocate for fear of capture. Just 4 days before Cooley went missing, Bundy reported the theft of his Utah plates, but actually kept them and used them intermittently with his newly issued plates. The method used to murder Melanie Cooley would seem to confirm Bundy as a suspect. It is strongly suspected that Bundy preferred strangulation as a method of dispatching his victims, providing a clean murder with little mess. Indeed, he had once said, "You feel the last bit of breath leaving their bodies. You're looking into their eyes." A person in that situation is God. This was one reason why he managed to stay one step ahead of the authorities by leaving as little evidence behind as possible. However, he was known to bludgeon his victims when orchestrating their kidnapping. For this, he would use a small tire iron or crowbar hidden in the wheel arch of his Volkswagen Bug, which he used to hit them over the head, something that served only to stun them before they were bound and put inside his vehicle. The crowbar became an integral part of Ted Bundy's murder kit. The death of Karen Campbell is one of the rare cases where the body of one of Bundy's victims was found. Almost all his other victims' remains were never located. In the case of Campbell, she had been beaten about the head from a blunt object that caused a large pool of blood that surrounded her head. Bundy was also known to use other objects, such as wooden logs when attacking his later Chi Omega victims. During his time on death row, Bundy began to confess to crimes committed in several states. He admitted to committing 3 murders in Colorado, those of Karen Campbell, Dennis Oliverson, and Julie Cunningham, who vanished in March 1975. He never admitted to any more in that state, and Colorado detectives never got the chance to question him over Melanie Cooley's murder. Despite Bundy kidnapping several women in Colorado, there has never been any evidence that connects him directly to Cooley's death. The circumstances of her murder seem to suggest that another killer was responsible, and that only the victim type and location offered the only evidence that Cooley was one of Bundy's victims. During his time on death row, when he began to confess to investigators, Bundy stated that he had killed 3 women in Colorado. He was quite specific when it came to numbers, and claimed 8 known murders in Utah, of which he was suspected, along 3 more unidentified. He seemingly never claimed Melanie Cooley as a victim. With no other suspects, Jefferson County authorities continue to treat her murder as a cold case. Case 10. In 2020, police in Kent matched the DNA sample of an unidentified killer was matched to hospital maintenance worker David Fuller. The crimes, the murder of 2 women just months apart in 1987 that had gone unsolved for decades. Once these crimes were connected to a single offender, police finally apprehended a long-dormant killer. The murders committed by Fuller were just the start of his crime. It was soon discovered that in his capacity as a hospital worker, he had recorded himself abusing the bodies of over 100 female corpses in different hospitals, sentenced to a whole life term. Fuller will never leave prison and will die in his cell for the heinous crimes he committed against the living and the dead. On Tuesday, June 23, 1987, 25-year-old Wendy Nell failed to turn up for work. This raised concerns with her employer, who in turn contacted her boyfriend Ian the following day. Upon turning up at her home in Guilford Road in Royal Tunbridge Wells, Kent, the boyfriend found Nell naked in her bed. She had been strangled and sexually assaulted by an intruder. Nell had moved into the ground floor bedsit at number 14 Guilford Road after the collapse of her marriage. Her friend at the time, Julie Monks, said she believes the breakup came as a blow and went on to describe Wendy as independent and hardworking. Monks added that Nell was determined to begin a family, have children, and make a home for them. The bedsit was reportedly run down, and Wendy disliked how small her home was and never allowed anyone to visit, spending as little time she possible there. When she left the bedsit at after 1800 hours p.m., she left the rear window open. She had been unable to close it because the latch had been painted over. This allowed easy access, and her ground floor flat backed out onto a poorly lit alleyway. At the time of her death, Nell was working as the manager at the Photoshop Super Snaps, and on the night of the Monday, June 22nd, her boyfriend had dropped her off at home around 11:15 p.m. Her neighbors later said they heard nothing out of the ordinary through the thin walls of the bedsit. Unbeknownst to anyone, Wendy Nell had been battered by an intruder, sexually assaulted and strangled. When she was found the next morning, her blood covered the bed on which she lay. It was believed that several items were missing from her flat, including her diary and a set of keys. The key fob had been a souvenir brought back from a recent visit to Austria and was considered unique, along with a brass Woman of the Year tag that was attached to the key fob. Neither of these items were found, and police suspected the killer had taken them. Several months later, on November 24, 1987, a young woman disappeared from her home. On the night, 20-year-old Caroline Pierce vanished. There were reports of screaming from her doorstep. It would be 3 weeks before her body was discovered, 40 miles away, dumped, naked apart from her tights, in an overgrown drainage ditch on farmland in Romney Marsh on the south coast. It was only by chance that her body was spotted by a tractor driver owing to his position high up in his vehicle's cab. Pierce, from Grosvenor Park, worked at Buster Brown's, a popular Tunbridge Wells restaurant. It was reported her injuries were similar to those carried out against Wendy Nell, and despite little evidence at the time, detectives suspected these two murders were somehow linked. The press referred to the two crimes as the bedsit murders. Police launched a comprehensive investigation. In Tunbridge Wells, several prowlers had been seen in the area. However, none of these incidents had been reported to police. 24 hours before Wendy Nell was murdered, a strange incident had been reported less than 50 yards away from her home. On June 21st, a 19-year-old was alone in her flat when she heard her doorbell ring. When she answered it, an unfamiliar man was standing at her door. He told her, "You shouldn't leave your window open, especially in the bedroom," before walking away. The witness later gave police a detailed description of the strange man she encountered at her door. At that time, during the 1980s, there was no CCTV for police to track the whereabouts of the two women in the days leading up to their murders, or the suspicious man who was seen on the previous Sunday. Neither was there any mobile phones that might help offer an insight into who the women were acquainted with and any potential leads or suspects. Coupled with the fact that DNA analysis was still in its infancy, police were facing an uphill struggle to solve what were two extremely complex murder investigations. It had only been 8 years previous that offender profiles had been created with the national database. Detectives knew that the killer, or killers, might not even be present in the database. At about 10:30 p.m., on the evening Wendy Nell was murdered, a neighbor who lived in the same building as Wendy saw a suspicious man in the alleyway behind Guilford Road. The witness said the man was trying to peep into the house directly opposite. The prowler reportedly watched inside for some minutes before he was disturbed. The police were not called. Later that same evening, at approximately 12:30 a.m., local residents reported that a peeping Tom was seen out of property on nearby Grove Hill Road. Then at 1:10 a.m. on Guilford Road, neighbors recalled a car, possibly a blue Talbot Horizon, having difficulty starting while parked outside Wendy's house. 2 days after Wendy's death, a new witness, a local shopkeeper, came forward and provided information that opened up a whole new line on inquiry. Bits and Pieces, a second-hand goods shop that specializes in collector's items, and the owner believed that Wendy was a regular customer. Over a period of 9 months, Wendy had visited the shop around once a fortnight, and always to look at or buy model train. Assuming that the customer was Wendy, none of the trains she bought have ever been found. They were not kept by herself, and so detectives wondered to whom she might have given them. There was forensic evidence left behind by the perpetrator. A bloody fingerprint had been found on a shopping bag, and a bloodied footprint could be seen on the cuff of a white blouse from Wendy's flat. A sperm sample was found on Caroline's tights, and saliva samples and other DNA were found on Ms. Nell's bedding, towel, and intimate samples. These items were carefully stored by police until such a time when they could be tested for a DNA profile and, hopefully, matched with an offender. With advances in forensic technology, detectives tested the DNA sample in 1999, but were disappointed when it failed to match anyone on the new database. It was believed that unless the killer had been arrested for some other offense, had his DNA taken as a result, then his profile would not have been entered into the database. As such, the DNA samples taken from the murder scenes would remain unidentified, despite the BBC Crime Watch appeals. One in October 1987 about the murder of Wendy Nell, which featured a detailed reconstruction. The trail went cold. Speaking in 2007, veteran detective Dave Stevens, who investigated the case, told the BBC, "We've scaled down the inquiry, but one thing we've never done is close the inquiry. There are no further developments in the case of the Bedsit murders, which essentially became a cold case until 2007. When a significant new lead was made during a cold case review, the samples were tested again, and this time there appeared to be a match, officially linking the murders of Wedney Nell and Caroline Pierce to the same unidentified perpetrator. By 2019, new techniques had been developed by forensics experts for collecting DNA from a damaged sperm sample like the one found on Caroline's tights. Another relatively new technique, known as familial DNA, was then applied, which allows scientists to identify whether someone is related to a person whose DNA is discovered at a crime scene. Noel McHugh, a former Metropolitan Police detective who advised the Kent investigators and now works for the National Crime Agency, said this technique was absolutely crucial in the apprehension of murder suspects. If it were not for the familial DNA testing, the DNA samples taken from the crime scenes would never have been linked to a suspect. But familial DNA allowed the investigators to bring down the 6.5 meters profiles on the National DNA Database to a workable number, which would eventually identify the killer, said Mr. McHugh, suspecting their killer was local, and with a list of people who lived in the nearby area of the murders, as well as the right age group. Detectives narrow their list. We came up with a long list of people, in order of which was the closest possibility of being the right relation of our offender, said Senior Investigating Officer, Detsupt Ivan Beasley. After a lengthy search, police eventually hit a match. The closest partial DNA match was from a man whose surname was Fuller. Police then studied the family tree and honed in on one relative, 63-year-old David Fuller. Investigators then began looking at the suspect and his criminal history. Unsurprisingly, Fuller had little in the way of a criminal past, at least nothing that was known to police. At school, he was in trouble with police for stealing bikes and damaging property and fires, but nothing that caused him to come to police attention. Born on September 4, 1954, Fuller had trained as an electrician and maintenance man while working in the Navy shipyards of Portsmouth. He was married 3 times and was interested in birdwatching, cycling, and photography. He became an unofficial photographer for London rock band Cutting Crew, and in 1985 accompanied them on tour with his second wife Sally. In late November 2020, a match was made between his DNA and the samples from the case. On December 3, 2020, police arrived at David Fuller's quiet estate and knocked on the door of the family's small semi-detached home, which was noticeably well equipped with CCTV cameras. He was arrested on suspicion of the double murders. The case, however, would prove to be much more complicated than detectives first believed. Under questioning, Fuller claimed he was not familiar with Tunbridge Wells, despite it being the next significant town. When asked, he denied ever visiting Super Snap's shop or Buster Brown's, and categorically denied knowing or being responsible for the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce. That was a lie, said Detsupt Beasley, and he and his detectives would prove it. From the search of his home, it became apparent to detectives that David Fuller had obsessively recorded his life. He kept diaries detailing nights out at restaurants and photos that showed his rides with a cycling club, along with the invoices he had issued as a maintenance man and electrician. This provided a wealth of information for officers to search through. Among the man invoices, police found somewhere for work around Tunbridge Wells, the area from where both women who had been murdered lived, and a place David Fuller denied ever visiting. From the pages of his diary entries, it was learned that he had been a regular customer at Buster Brown's, where victim Caroline Pierce worked. Fuller had actually lived on the same road as Wendy in the 1970s and 80s, before she moved in. Police contacted the cycling club and spoke with members in an effort to see if they remembered the routes taken during that time, which it turned out included through Romney Marsh, where Caroline was discovered. One of the photographs found at Fuller's home shows him lying on his stomach on a sunny day in the 1980s, his feet upturned, the soles of his Clark's shoes exposed. There, in the image, police could see that the pattern matched the print found in Wendy's flat. When his fingerprints were taken, they were found to be a match to the bloody print on the shopping bag. However, The most damning evidence against David Fuller was that his DNA matched the semen sample taken decades before from Caroline's tights. After 33 years, detectives had finally caught their killer. As the investigation continued, no one could have imaged it would take an even darker turn when shocking new evidence emerged. Further crimes were committed before the two Tunbridge Wells murders, and these included a series of what police called creeper burglaries he committed in the 1970s. But there were far more insidious crimes that David Fuller had committed, crimes which were revealed during the extensive searches of his home. Since the 1980s, Fuller had hoarded computer hardware, including hundreds of hard drives. Forensic experts found the number staggering, with memory cards and obsolete storage disks numbering in the thousands. There were 30 mobile phones and SIM cards alone, and other assorted devices. When examining a cupboard, they came across more. Inside the cupboard, Fuller had positioned a cabinet, and once pulled away from the wall, it revealed a holder screwed to the back. Described as a concealed hide, it was found to contain a further 4 hard drives. They contained some of the most disturbing evidence. On the hard drives were videos, apparently filmed by Fuller inside a hospital mortuary. From the contents of these videos, it soon became apparent to detectives that David Fuller had been sexually abusing the bodies of dead people. Noel McHugh recalls the day he first opened the report that detailed this latest lurid detail in the investigation. "I could not comprehend it," he said. "My thoughts were very much for Wendy Nell's family and Caroline Pierce's 33 years without justice. But now families are finding out that their loved one, when they should have been safe and afforded dignity in death, suffered at the hands of David Fuller." It was learned that during his time working at various hospitals, Fuller was provided with an Access All Areas swipe card. This also provided him with access to the mortuary, an area he regularly visited. At one of the newer hospitals, the fridges used to store the bodies of deceased patients have doors at each end, one of which is covered by CCTV cameras. However, the other, where post-mortem examinations take place, naturally has none. Fuller knew this, because police found no footage from the hospital of what he was doing. Instead, they relied heavily on his own videos, filmed on a small camera, which showed him interfering with as many as 100 female corpses. The evidence was damning. Investigators were able to pause the footage to read details on patients' wristbands by cross-referencing the metadata on the videos, which showed when they had been filmed, with the names of patients in the mortuary at the time. Forensic experts were able to confirm the dates of Fuller's offending. He even kept a little black book into which he recorded the many names of his deceased victims. Libby Clark, a senior Crown prosecutor, said he wouldn't leave them alone. He went back to them on different occasions. "This is the most disturbing and challenging case I have ever been involved with." Fuller's offending within hospitals is believed to have involved as many as 100 victims whose ages range from under 18 to over 85, and taken place between the years of 2008 and 2020. Equally as disturbing was the discovery in David Fuller's house of what police described as one of the biggest stashes of child sexual abuse images ever discovered, which included millions of images and videos. The psychopathology at work here is very definitely sadomasochism, says Dr. Richard Badcock, a consultant forensic psychiatrist whose work for the police includes assessing Harold Shipman. Dr. Badcock believes Fuller's crimes followed a distinctive pattern. In essence, not being able to deal with your own issues except by manipulative behavior. David Fuller was living a deceptive and double life. His NHS sources say colleagues saw him as helpful, the guy who would change a light bulb or fix a fuse with a smile, while behind closed doors, he was committing the most appalling crimes. Dr. Badcock believes the progression of Fuller's crimes began with voyeurism, as seen in the creeper burglaries Fuller committed in the 1970s, before gradually escalating his behavior into murder and abuse. Although you are doing extreme things, you might only feel alive in the moment of the offense. Fuller had worked in electrical maintenance at hospitals since 1989 and was at the Kent and Sussex Hospital until it closed in September 2011. He was then transferred to the Tunbridge Wells Hospital at Penbury, where he committed further offenses against the deceased until his arrest. The direct link between the sexual homicides of Wendy and Caroline and the later offenses in the mortuary are what Dr. Badcock regards as psychologically more extreme than murder. Necrophilia. That's it. There's nowhere else to go after that. It is a crime that ironically carries a maximum 2-year sentence compared to life for murder. On January 21, 2021, David Fuller entered a plea of not guilty for the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce. He was remanded in custody to await his trial, which was expected to begin on October 25th. On October 8th, Fuller admitted to killing the 2 women. Duncan Atkinson QC, prosecuting, told Maidstone Crown Court that David Fuller accepted he killed the 2 women subject to the issue of diminished responsibility. His trial was then set for November 1st. On the 4th day of the trial at Maidstone Crown Court, Fuller changed his plea to guilty. He had also previously admitted sexually abusing bodies in 2 Kent Hospital morgues over 12 years. Ahead of the trial, he had pleaded guilty to 51 offenses, these including 44 charges relating to 78 identified victims in the 2 mortuaries where he worked as an electrician. After he was rearranged, Mrs. Justice Shemagrab directed the jury to find him guilty on both counts of murder. During the proceedings, the court heard from the relatives of Fuller's victims. A victim impact statement was read to the court by the mother of the 9-year-old girl. Wearing a gray sweatshirt and black mask due to COVID regulations, Fuller looked down for most of the hearing, but raised his eyes when the mother addressed him. "You raped my baby." She couldn't say no to a dirty, 66-year-old man who was abusing her body, she said. She couldn't say no, but she would have. There's no closure. How can I make this up to her? How can I nurse that little broken body that's been ruined and disrespected by that vile man? I will never be able to get over this, she said. Another woman spoke before the court, talking about her mother. She told the court Fuller's actions were despicable, sick, and twisted, and that it was hard to comprehend something so immoral. She was dead, vulnerable, and not able to fend you off, but you preyed on her on the day she died, she said. Owing to Fuller's crimes at the mortuaries, police suspect that Wendy Nell had been raped after her death. In 2007, Wendy Nell's father, Bill, told the media, "One day, someone's going to ring that door and say, 'We've caught him,' and there will be a celebration. By God, there will be, especially if he goes down for a very, very long time." Sadly, Bill Nell never lived to see David Fuller sentenced for the murder of his daughter. Investigators said Fuller would always go into the morgues only when other staff had left, often visiting the same bodies repeatedly. Duncan Atkinson, a prosecutor in the case, said Fuller systematically and repeatedly sexually abused the bodies of at least 102 dead women and girls. The victims included a 9-year-old girl, 2 16-year-olds, and a woman aged 100. In a statement read to the court by a prosecutor, Katrina Frost, mother of Caroline Pierce, said the murder of her daughter was truly horrific and a nightmare, which continues to this day. It said that David Fuller was an animal who returned to a normal life with his family after the murder, while for them life was never the same again. "I can never forget having to identify the badly damaged body of my own daughter," Ms. Frost said. "The images of seeing my daughter in that way repeat over and over in my mind. She must have been absolutely terrified." In a victim impact statement read to the court, Wendy Nell's was described Mother Pamela as a thoughtful person who would do anything for anyone. She wanted children, but did not get to have any, said Mrs. Nell, adding, "We've had to live with her loss, with no other comfort for the rest of our lives." The families of the victims told Maidstone Crown Court that Fuller was an animal and despicable, sick and twisted. Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb told Fuller during sentencing, There is so much sorrow in this community because of what you have done. Your actions go against everything that is right and humane. They are incomprehensible. You had no regard for the dignity of the dead. She sentenced David Fuller to two whole life sentences for the murders with a concurrent 12-year term for his other crimes. The investigation into the identification and apprehension of David Fuller was a huge police operation costing £2.5 million. It was, however, a success, linking Fuller to the double killings dubbed the Bedsit murders, and helped uncover the later crimes committed at the Kent and Sussex Hospital, also in Tunbridge Wells, and the Tunbridge Wells Hospital in nearby which replaced it. David Fuller was handed a whole life order on December 15, 2021, meaning he will never be released from prison. In the months and years after his sentencing, he admitted to further cases of mortuary sexual abuse, including 12 counts of sexual penetration of a corpse and 4 counts of possession of extreme pornography between 2007 and 2020. Mrs. Justice Chima Grubbs sentenced Fuller at the Old Bailey on December 7, 2022, to a further 4 years, telling him his victims' relatives had had their memories sullied and stolen, and that they have been left in a dark place. They have expressed the outrage and revulsion that the women you abused would have felt at your objectivization of them. Addressing Fuller directly, the daughter of one of his victims said, "David, I want you to know how much damage you have caused, how your sick and twisted behavior has damaged families like mine. I'm pleased you are now being held accountable for what you did only 7 hours after she died." Mrs. Justice Chimagrab went on to highlight the victim's achievements in life, saying one had been a talented skier, others had worked as teachers, or in the NHS, and one had worked at Bletchley Park during the Second World War. One of the prosecutors, Libby Clark, said, "Fuller's actions were depraved, disgusting, and dehumanizing, on a scale that has never been encountered before in legal history." Detsupt Ivan Beasley from Kent Police said of the latest sentencing, "Today's sentencing will mean little to this abhorrent individual, who throughout our investigation has demonstrated no remorse and only a capacity for self-pity." As a result of the unmasking of David Fuller, the government announced an independent inquiry into how he went undetected until his capture. The case of David Fuller, one of abhorrent crimes committed against both the living and the dead. His mortuary crimes against the deceased are known to have taken place between 2008 and 2020. However, there remains a glaring hole in his record, with no known offending between 1987 and 2008. Kent Police are now examining the records of missing people, and questions are being asked if he could have killed or abused others. Case 11. In the late 1960s, the city of Glasgow, Scotland, was gripped by fear as a series of brutal murders shook the community. The perpetrator, came to be known as Bible John, remains one of Scotland's most notorious and elusive serial killers. Despite extensive investigations, his identity has never been definitively uncovered, leaving a legacy of mystery and terror. The crimes attributed to Bible John occurred between 1968 and 1969, with 3 women falling victim to his violence. All 3 murders shared chilling similarities, suggesting the work of a single killer. The first victim, Patricia Docker, a 25-year-old nurse, was found on February 23, 1968. She had been strangled and beaten, her body discovered in a back lane near her home. Docker had spent the previous evening at the Barrowland Ballroom, popular dance hall in Glasgow. Less than a year later, on August 16, 1969, Jemima MacDonald, a 32 mother of 3, was found murdered in a similar fashion. She had also been strangled and beaten, and her body was discovered in an abandoned building. Like Docker, MacDonald had spent the evening at the Barrowland Ballroom. The pattern of the crimes began to emerge, focusing the investigation on the dance hall and its patrons. The third and final known victim was Helen Puddock, a 29-year-old mother of 2, whose body was found on October 31, 1969. Puddock had been raped, strangled and beaten. She too had spent the evening at the Berlin ballroom. The key piece of evidence in Pudik's case came from her sister, Jean, who had accompanied her to the ballroom that night. Jean provided a detailed description of the man they had met and shared a taxi with after leaving the dance hall. This man had identified himself as John. Jean Pudik's description portrayed a well-dressed man in his mid-20s to early 30s, around 6 feet tall, with reddish or fair hair and a distinctive Glasgow accent. He had mentioned quotes from the Bible during their conversation, which led to his infamous moniker, Bible John. Despite this crucial eyewitness account, the investigation struggled to identify the suspect. The hunt for Bible John was extensive and high-profile. Police conducted door-to-door inquiries, interviewed thousands of potential witnesses, and distributed composite sketches based on Jean Pudik's description. However, the case was plagued by a lack of concrete evidence and reliable leads. The Berlin ballroom became a focal point of the investigation, but no definitive connections were made. In the decades following the murders, numerous theories and suspects have emerged. One theory posits that Peter Tobin, a convicted serial killer with a history of violence against women, could be Bible John. Tobin lived in Glasgow during the late 1960s, and his known crimes bore similarities to those attributed to Bible John. However, no conclusive evidence has linked Tobin to the Berlin murders, and he has never been charged in connection with them. Advances in forensic technology have not yet provided a breakthrough in the case. DNA evidence collected from the crime scenes was inconclusive, and many key pieces of evidence have degraded over time. Despite renewed efforts and occasional media interest, the true identity of Bible John remains a mystery. The case of Bible John continues to haunt Glasgow, a reminder of a dark period in the city's history. The unresolved nature of the murders leaves open questions about justice for the victims and their families. Bible John stands as one of the most enduring enigmas in the annals of Scottish crime, a shadowy figure whose true identity may never be uncovered. Case 12. Haute de la Gorine, a former children's home on the island of Jersey, became the epicenter of a shocking investigation that exposed a history of abuse and neglect spanning several decades. What was once considered a place of refuge for vulnerable children evolved into a harrowing symbol of systemic failure and betrayal. Built in the 19th century, Haute de la Gorine served various purposes over the years, including use as a youth hostel and later as a residential care facility for children. However, the idyllic facade masked a darker reality of abuse that persisted for many years, hidden behind closed doors. The turning point in exposing the atrocities occurred in 2008, when the States of Jersey Police launched Operation Rectangle, a comprehensive investigation into historical child abuse allegations on the island. The focus quickly shifted to the Jersey care home, as survivors came forward with harrowing accounts of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse suffered within its walls. The investigation uncovered a deeply disturbing pattern of mistreatment and exploitation that had persisted over several decades. Survivors recounted tales of cruelty, violence, and sexual assault at the hands of those entrusted with their care. The institutionalized nature of the abuse pointed to a systemic failure in oversight and accountability. One of the most shocking aspects of the investigation was the discovery of a secret underground chamber at Haute de la Gorine, colloquially referred to as the punishment room. This sinister space was believed to have been used for both physical punishment and sexual abuse, further confirming the horrifying extent of the crimes committed against vulnerable children. Forensic teams meticulously examined the site, unearthing evidence of decades-old crimes. The remains of shackles, restraints, and fragments of a bath that survivors claimed was used for punishment were among the haunting artifacts recovered from the underground chamber. The grim discoveries painted a vivid picture of the institutionalized cruelty that had persisted within Haute de la Gorine for generations. As the investigation progressed, it became evident that the culture of silence and complicity had allowed the abuse to fester unchecked. Survivors faced not only physical and emotional trauma, but also the profound injustice of having their pleas for help dismissed or ignored. The revelation of these dark secrets at Haute de la Garenne sparked outrage and prompted a broader conversation about the need for accountability and reform within the childcare system. The legal repercussions of Operation Rectangle were significant. Several individuals, including former staff members of Haute de la Garenne, were arrested and charged with various offenses, ranging from physical assault to sexual abuse. The investigation extended beyond the children's home, implicating other individuals and institutions on the island. There have been unsubstantiated rumors that Edward Paisnell, the sex offender known as the Beast of Jersey, had been involved in the child abuse committed at the Jersey Children's Care Home. Similarly, it was found that former DJ Jimmy Savile, later unmasked as a prolific sex offender, had visited the children's care home and was pictured outside with a group of children. The fallout from Haute de la Garenne prompted a reassessment of child protection policies in Jersey, with a focus on preventing future instances of abuse and ensuring that survivors receive the support they deserve. The island's government faced scrutiny for its role in oversight and accountability, leading to calls for systemic reforms within the child welfare system. The old dilapidated building used as a children's care home stands as a stark reminder of the profound impact that institutional abuse can have on vulnerable individuals. The investigation not only exposed the crimes committed within its walls, but also ignited a broader conversation about the importance of safeguarding the welfare of children in institutional care. Haute de la Garenne serves as a cautionary tale, prompting societies to remain vigilant in protecting the most vulnerable members and ensuring that those responsible for their care are held accountable for any breaches of trust.